Good afternoon and good morning to those of us joining online. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this international forum. My name is Esfandir Batmagelic, and before we begin, I'm going to share a few housekeeping notes. First off, we're delighted to welcome everyone in person. We ask that while you're not speaking to please keep your masks on. Please make use of the hand sanitizer that's been provided. For those of us joining online, I'd like to mention that at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll be able to select simultaneous interpretation in either Russian or English or Uzbek. If you select the language that you would like to follow the proceedings in, the translation will switch automatically for your convenience. For those of us here in Tashkent, headsets were available at the front of the room. I invite you to pick one up if you have not already so that you can benefit from the translation. We have a fantastic program today. I'm really impressed with the program that the World Bank and, of course, the State Assets Management Agency of the Republic of Uzbekistan have put together. We are going to be having a very extensive discussion about the transformation and privatization of state-owned enterprises. But without further ado, allow me to turn the floor over to Mr. Marco Mantovanelli, who's the country director for Uzbekistan of the World Bank. Marco, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome, everyone. Mr. Kuchkarov, Minister Ishmetov, Director Ortikov, thank you for being with us today. It's a pleasure for the World Bank to be able to facilitate this event in partnership with the State Asset Management Agency. We are at a critical and important stage of the reform process in Uzbekistan, and it is timely that we have a discussion on the transformation, privatization, state-owned enterprises. We hope we will be able to bring here the experiences of other countries who went through these processes before, both positive and challenges, and that this be useful to Uzbekistan. So I know that we have a very intense agenda, and I will not want to waste time with introductions, just a big warm welcome. And we are looking forward to making sure that this is a start of a conversation that will be producing fruits, and that these fruits will be very useful to Uzbekistan. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marco. And now it's my pleasure to welcome His Excellency Jamshid Kuchkarov, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Economic Development and Poverty Reduction. Minister Kuchkarov will be giving the first keynote of the day.
Assalamu alaikum. Уважаемые дамы и господа, уважаемая госпожа Bjerde, дорогие друзья, прежде всего искренне рад приветствовать всех участников данного форума, который, я надеюсь, станет очень хорошей площадкой для обмена мнениями по актуальным для нашей страны вопросам с участием ведущих экспертов и международных организаций. Прежде всего, хотел бы поблагодарить Всемирный банк в лице господина Мантованелли и, конечно же, руководство Всемирного банка за и другие международные организации, которые здесь участвуют, всех наших друзей, за поддержку данного форума. Приватизация и трансформация государственных предприятий, вам известно, является одним из приоритетных направлений совершенствования современных методов управления, открытых, прозрачных и рыночных принципов, создание широких возможностей для участия в процессе реформ частного капитала, сокращения присутствия государства в экономике и дальнейшего улучшения конкурентной среды. Несмотря на сложившуюся социально-экономическую ситуацию в регионе в связи с ограничительными мерами пандемии, Узбекистан продолжает положительный рост экономики, и мы видим одним из основных результатов или причин, точнее не результатов, а причин такого роста, несмотря на пандемию, является та политика, которая проводилась до этого и проводится руководителем нашей страны, его превосходительством, президентом Республики Узбекистан Шавкат Миромоновичем Мирзияевым. То есть мы хотим сказать, что тот экономический рост, который мы достигли, несмотря на пандемию, является продолжением, точнее, результатом тех реформ, которые были проведены до начала пандемии, и той активной политикой реформ и активной политикой стимулирования экономики, которая проводилась в нашей стране. Поэтому всем вам известно, что, конечно, пандемия внесла ряд серьезных корректив в повестку дня экономической политики, и вы все знаете, что особенно в первой половине, даже первые 3 квартала прошлого года все страны, наряду с этим Узбекистан тоже был занят в основном текущими экономическими мерами, включая поддержку здравоохранения, борьбой с пандемией и так далее. Но вам известно, что уже в 4 квартале прошлого года в условиях пандемии руководством страны было принято решение об приватизации и ускорении трансформации государственных предприятий. У нас есть твердая повестка дня реформ, которая будет продолжаться, и я могу в качестве примера привести недавний визит госпожи Бьерде в Узбекистан, ее очень успешную, теплую и конструктивную встречу с уважаемым президентом Республики Узбекистана. И это, я думаю, еще раз показало, и она, вся делегация Всемирного банка, еще раз убедилась, насколько руководитель Узбекистана привержен к реформам. Почему? Потому что руководство страны считает именно экономические реформы надежной основой для экономического роста в Узбекистане и, соответственно, процветания и, конечно же, повышения благосостояния людей, сокращения бедности и так далее. С этой точки зрения перед нами стоят очень большие задачи по увеличению экономического роста, по росту ВВП на душу населения. И именно одним из условий, драйверов реализации задач, стоящих перед нами, мы видим приватизацию государственных активов и трансформацию государственных предприятий. Поэтому я прежде всего хотел бы сказать всем участникам сегодняшнего форума то, что повестка сегодняшнего дня очень злободневная для нашей страны, для наших как текущих, так и перспективных задач. Поэтому прежде всего я вас хочу, точнее вам напомнить о том, что в дополнение к октябрьскому решению президента Республики Узбекистан в феврале также подписан указ о мерах по дальнейшему ускорению процессов приватизации государственных активов, основным из посылов которого является отмена всех льгот, предоставляемых госпредприятиям для обеспечения равных возможностей всем хозяйствующим субъектам. В этом отношении мы планируем сокращение количества государственных предприятий в 2021-2025 годов на 75%. В этом смысле неоценимо, и мы надеемся на практическое содействие всех международных институтов, финансовых институтов. Это Всемирный банк, Азиатский банк, Европейский банк, ООН и их аффилированных структур. Пользуясь данной возможностью, также хотел бы отметить важность тех наших партнеров, которые участвуют как непосредственно в процессах трансформации, так и приватизации государственных активов. целях эффективного и транспарентного осуществления процессов приватизации и трансформации государственных активов осуществляется масштабная работа по привлечению интеллектуальных ресурсов международных организаций. В частности, в этой сфере мы работаем со Всемирным банком, у нас имеется займ наращивания институционального потенциала. Вообще, конечно же, немножко, может, даже отойду от нашей сегодняшней темы. Мы очень много обсуждаем, многие вопросы, и все-таки вот еще раз я хотел бы сказать, что мы очень ценим ту помощь, которую нам оказывают наши партнеры, не только в смысле финансирования каких-либо проектов, а также особенно техническое содействие. То есть вот укрепление capacity. Вы знаете, что это, к сожалению, вообще укрепление потенциала наших министерств, ведомств, экономического блока является для нас очень важной задачей. И с точки зрения повышения capacity АУГа, Агентства по управлению госактивами, мы очень надеемся на успешную реализацию этого проекта. И вы знаете, что в АУГа работают два постоянных консультанта, и мы очень ценим их вклад в то дело, которое мы осуществляем. Также я хотел бы вас проинформировать о том, что в рамках намеченных реформ по приватизации и трансформации государственных активов в текущем году планируется внедрение стратегии управления и реформирования предприятий государственным участием на 2021-2025 годы и дорожной карты по ее реализации. Также предусматривается создание экспертного совета для выявления проблем в области корпоративного управления, реструктуризации и приватизации государственных предприятий, обмена мнениями и выработки позиций по основным направлениям организации деятельности агентства по управлению государственными активами на основе современных подходов и методов. Также мы работаем над законопроектами о приватизации и об управлении государственным имуществом. Хотел бы небольшой пример привести о том, насколько нам нужно изменение законодательных основ функционирования государственных предприятий и приватизации, трансформации. Вот сегодня утром мы, например, коллегой, министром финансов Тимуром Инджановичем обсуждали вопросы Новоинского горно-металлургического комбината. Согласно нашему законодательству, мы там должны создать ревизионную комиссию. Это достаточно старое понимание или... То есть немножко, как бы помягче сказать, не соответствует тому вектору движения, который мы осуществляем по вопросу трансформации государственных предприятий. И руководитель АУГа, господин Орtikov, нам говорит, что эту комиссию можно не создавать, потому что мы очень скоро уже в законодательстве исключим о необходимости создания такой комиссии. Поэтому это, может, небольшой пример, но очень свежий пример, сегодняшний утренний пример, поэтому я, с вашего позволения, решил с вами поделиться вот таким частным небольшим примером. Уважаемые участники форума, также, пользуясь случаем, я хотел бы продолжение темы Новоинского горного комбината, хотел бы вас проинформировать, что мы, значит, сейчас принимаем меры по выполнению решения президента Республики Узбекистан по реструктуризации государственного предприятия Новоинский горно-металлургический комбинат. Вам известно, что данное государственное предприятие является важнейшим госактивом в Узбекистане. Его объемы говорят сами за себя, это более чем 80 тонн золота, наверное, с дивидендами порядка 30% бюджета, да? Порядка 30% бюджета, доходов бюджета, несколько десятков тысяч работников. То есть это, вы знаете, что этот комбинат является крупным бизнесом не только в масштабе нашей страны, но и в мировом масштабе. Руководством нашей страны поставлена задача перед правительством, перед наблюдательным советом и менеджментом вновь созданного акционерного общества НГМК преобразовать производство золота, и данный комбинат один из международно признанных высокоэффективных компаний. Поэтому сейчас, например, я хотел бы вам сказать, что сформирован наблюдательный совет, и туда мы привлекаем независимых наблюдателей. Это тоже, вы знаете, новый тренд в трансформации государственных предприятий. Это началось чуть пораньше. Вы знаете, Министерством финансов уже привлечены несколько специалистов международного уровня в государственные коммерческие банки. Поэтому, то есть этот тренд теперь идет, распространяется и для государственных предприятий также. Теперь то, что касается некоторых энергетических компаний. Когда мы говорим о трансформации госпредприятий, конечно же, мы обязательно должны говорить про энергетические компании. Это прежде всего нефтегазовая компания, транспортная Узтрансгаз и региональные. Аналогично электрические компании. То есть по этим компаниям тоже у нас идет работа, и вообще я хотел бы поблагодарить, пользуясь случаем, Азиатский банк развития, например, они работают по газотранспортной системе, и вообще мы хотим углубить и усилить реформу наших энергетических компаний. Мы очень в скором времени поделимся и нашими партнерами, Азиатским банком, Всемирным банком, нашим видением реформы газового сектора, энергетического сектора. И здесь, вы знаете, мы очень хотели бы вашей дальнейшей поддержки, и в то же время мы хотели бы и обеспечить координацию помощи со стороны международных финансовых институтов одновременно с теми консультационными компаниями. Это, например, вот я здесь вижу PricewaterhouseCoopers, также в эти сектора привлекаются Rothschild, этот BCG, McKinsey, многие другие компании. И, конечно же, мы очень хотим построить эффективную координацию всей той технической помощи, которая будет оказываться энергетическому сектору именно в целях реформы, дальнейшего углубления реформы данного сектора. Также я хотел бы вас проинформировать о том, что мы запустили процессы подготовки по приватизации 18 крупных государственных активов с привлечением Международной финансовой корпорации и других МФИ, а также консалтинговых компаний Большой Четверки в банковском, строительном и страховом секторах, а также виноводочной отрасли. И результаты по некоторым из них мы ожидаем уже в этом году. Также я хотел бы поблагодарить Международную финансовую корпорацию за хорошую работу по приватизации ипотеки банка. И, конечно же, мы очень надеемся на успешные результаты по трансформации и приватизации Узпромстройбанка. Также вы, наверное, знаете, Министерство финансов работает с банком АСАК при содействии Европейского банка реконструкции и развития. Мы очень надеемся, что ЕВРР и Министерство финансов найдут взаимоприемлемые, эффективные решения. Также сейчас объявлено о приватизации двух небольших государственных банков. Это, откровенно говоря, не очень значимые банки, но мы имеем очень хороший интерес к ним. Это Узагроэкспортбанк и Пойтахбанк. Также для приватизации предприятий в сфере строительства и производства строительных материалов в качестве инвестиционного консультанта привлечена компания Deloitte, а страховые предприятия компания Grant Thornton. И KPMG работает по приватизации виноводочных предприятий. Уважаемые участники форума, мы очень надеемся, что принятые меры позволят предприятиям, которые пройдут через процессы трансформации или приватизации, это позволит им провести хороший реинжиниринг бизнес-процессов, оптимизацию расходов, оптимизацию производственных цепочек и, конечно же, внедрить информационные технологии, кардинально сократить количество непрофильных активов. Вы знаете, буквально неделю тому назад правительство Узбекистана приняло очень большое постановление по выводу из состава государственных компаний непрофильных активов. Это тысячи и тысячи непрофильных активов, которые также подлежат приватизации. И также мы надеемся, что трансформация государственных предприятий, приватизация позволит многим из них повысить эффективность, повысить прибыльность, получать рейтинги и, конечно же, выходить на международные рынки капитала. Уважаемые участники форума, сегодня другие мои коллеги тоже, конечно, остановятся на многих вопросах. Конечно, я не смогу охватить многие вопросы, которые входят в сегодняшнюю повестку дня, и у меня нет такой цели. И, конечно же, в заключение хотел бы пожелать участникам форума плодотворных дискуссий и конструктивных предложений с выводом их для практической реализации. Также в заключение я хотел бы вам сказать, что сейчас мы очень рады тому, что приватизация привлекает очень большой интерес внутренних инвесторов. Это, конечно, может небольшие объекты. Так, где-то это всего 0,3 миллиона, где-то 1 миллион долларов стоит. Так, это где-то недвижимость на 5 миллионов, на 10 миллионов. Мы имеем огромный интерес. Например, то, что касается областей тоже, в регионах продаются земельные участки под, например, под туристические цели, под рекреацию и так далее. И это прежде всего, откровенно говоря, для нас одним из самых позитивных сигналов является то, что внутренние инвесторы, предприниматели очень интересуются приватизацией, они хотят купить, или, если попроще говоря, не протокольным языком, они стали доверять государству, они стали верить тому, что можно купить что-то у государства и делать честный бизнес на этом активе. Поэтому мы считаем это хорошим сигналом, но именно сигналом, потому что мы хотим большего. Мы хотим большего, чтобы все больше и больше как внутренних, так и иностранных инвесторов участвовали в процессах приватизации, как маленьких, так и больших. Мы не ставим перед собой какую-то цель объявить, что там вот, мол, мы такой большой объект продаем или что-то. Нет, нам нужен интерес и широкое участие. Поэтому я вас еще раз поблагодарю за ваше решение принять участие в сегодняшнем форуме и хочу еще раз поблагодарить всех участников сегодняшнего форума. Спасибо большое.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I'll take the opportunity. You mentioned the important role that consultants and advisors will play in implementing the privatization. And I'll take the opportunity to mention that in addition to the over 100 people gathered here today, including representatives of many of the companies that you spoke about, we also have about 280 people joining us online. So we have a large global audience very much engaged in the future of privatizations in this country. Now, it's my pleasure to turn the floor over to Anna Bjerde, who is the Regional Vice President for Europe and Central Asia at the World Bank. Ms. Bjerde was in Uzbekistan about 2 weeks ago on what I understand was a very productive delegation visit. And I'm sure that she has a number of things to reflect upon from that trip. So Ms. Bjerde, I turn the floor to you.
Thank you so much. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Forum on State-Owned Enterprise Reform and Privatization, organized jointly by the State Assets Management Agency and the World Bank. I'm very honored to be sharing a virtual podium with His Excellency Jamshid Kuchkarov, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Economic Development and Poverty Reduction, whom I had the pleasure to engage with just last week during my first visit to Tashkent. I want to also take this opportunity to once again thank Deputy Prime Minister Kuchkarov and other government leaders for the very warm welcome I received, which made my visit very fruitful and productive. Our discussions touched on several important issues, including progress Uzbekistan has achieved in its efforts to transform and privatize large state-owned enterprises. At the World Bank, we believe that rethinking the role of the state-owned ownership in enterprises is all the more important since SOEs remain a major economic actor in many countries around the world. And more often than not, SOEs are characterized by inefficiencies, financial losses, and lack of modernization and expansion. The COVID-19 pandemic has shown a renewed spotlight on performance of SOEs, especially those providing essential services such as healthcare, electricity, and water. The performance of SOEs often directly affects livelihoods of citizens and shapes the domestic business environment. Poor service delivery and lack of effective infrastructure provided by state-owned utilities and other SOEs are often cited in surveys around the world as major constraints to investment and economic growth. In addition, poor service delivery tends to disproportionately affect poor people, which in turn undermines trust in government. SOEs also often operate as monopolies and enjoy an unfair advantage through preferential access to land, underpriced state-directed financing, and preferential regulatory policies. This negatively impacts competition by limiting private sector investment and growth, reducing innovation, and the creation of new jobs. In Uzbekistan, with its legacy of the state-led economic model, 50% of the country's GDP is still derived from state-driven economic activities. The COVID crisis has made the transition to a market economy even more important for Uzbekistan. About 9% of the population still lives below the World Bank's poverty line for lower middle-income countries, such as Uzbekistan, and significantly more Uzbeks live close to this line. During the peak of the pandemic, nearly 1 million additional Uzbeks slipped into poverty. A primary development challenge in Uzbekistan is the creation of new, productive, and sustainable jobs. This requires an accelerated transition toward a private sector-driven, market-based economy. Uzbekistan's public sector will not be able to create the large number of jobs required to meet the needs of a young labor force that is expected to continue growing until 2040. Accelerating the reform of SOEs and creating a competitive and inclusive private sector-led growth model, as stated in Uzbekistan's 2017-2021 National Development Strategy, is therefore essential. The World Bank and other development partners have provided support in shaping the important initial steps to market reforms, improve business environment, and reduce the role of SOEs in the Uzbekistan economy. For example, the SOE ownership function over centrally owned SOEs is now carried out by SAMA, which acts as the SOE shareholder and is mandated to develop and implement an SOE ownership policy, good corporate governance practices, appoint SOE board members, monitor financial performance, and develop and enforce key performance indicators. SAMA is also embarking on a privatization program that will significantly reduce the number of SOEs in the country. I would like to congratulate the government on the adoption of the SOE ownership strategy of March 2021. This important policy provides a solid vision for SOE reforms and builds on sound underpinnings of OECD's guidelines on corporate governance of state-owned enterprises, as well as the World Bank Corporate Governance of State-Owned Enterprise Toolkit. These and other important steps are setting the foundations for further progress. Let me mention a few. The establishment of SAMA creates preconditions for a centralized oversight over SOEs and institutionalizes SOE ownership functions. The strategic mapping of 2,800 SOEs and their categorization provides the opportunity to apply a more strategic approach to their transformation. The adoption of an SOE strategy and the ambitious plans to adopt modern corporate governance practices and apply international financial reporting standards in the largest SOEs will improve credibility and transparency. The adoption of a new privatization law will help improve the legal framework for selling larger enterprises, and a state property management law will help instill clear ownership principles for SOEs that will remain in government hands. Reforming SOEs is a complex and challenging process. A comprehensive framework and roadmap are paramount to this process and to the implementation of a just, transparent, and accountable privatization process. This will ensure credibility of these important reforms and reinforce the message of benefiting society as a whole. Privatization of SOEs is equally challenging and complex, but that we have experience to draw from and learn from. For example, in Central and Eastern Europe, the predominant approach in transition countries was to privatize as quickly as possible. Looking back, this resulted in some missteps that should be avoided. China has the largest SOE sector in the world and has undertaken persistent effort to reform their SOEs. I'm very glad to see my colleague, Martin Razer, who is the World Bank's country director for China, is a keynote speaker today. He will be able to share firsthand knowledge about China's experience in SOE reform, both on the successes as well as the challenges the country has faced in the process. As a relatively latecomer to the SOE reform agenda, Uzbekistan has the opportunity to learn from others. As I come towards the end of my opening remarks, allow me to highlight a few lessons that we at the World Bank have collected over the years. First, the rule of law, competition, market regulation enforcement, good governance, and regulation really matter in privatization. A comprehensive institutional framework is an important ingredient for a transparent and accountable privatization process. There has to be clarity as to who regulates, who implements, and who supervises. Furthermore, careful planning is paramount. While small-scale privatization can be implemented more quickly, larger companies require much more effort, often including restructuring as well as time. Experience also shows that privatization of SOEs had greater positive impact when it was total rather than partial. And finally, social implications, in particular job losses, need to be carefully considered, and social programs should be defined and regulated early on in the process and in consultation with labor representation. I'm very encouraged by the progress made so far and the very high-level political support for this agenda in Uzbekistan. With the pressing need for more dynamic private sector in the country and much stronger job creation, SOE reforms are critical in helping to unlock Uzbekistan's full economic potential. The World Bank is committed to continue supporting you in this complex reform area and provide you with concrete and practical tools in implementing the reforms. I also would like to recognize the good collaboration with our partners, from the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the Asian Development Bank, the UNDP, and the French Development Agency. With these words, I would like to thank you for the opportunity to be with you today, and I hope you have a very successful roundtable.
Thank you, Ms. Bjerde. The point you raised about drawing on past experience is a major theme of this conference, and we'll be looking at these other comparative cases in the panels to come. But now I have the pleasure of introducing Mr. Adham Ikramov, who's the chairman of the Chamber of Commerce and Industry of Uzbekistan. And naturally, the engagement of the business leaders of state-owned enterprises is critical for the success of privatization. And so we're fortunate to have Mr. Ikramov here today. Please.
Уважаемые дамы и господа, уважаемые почетные спикеры, участники форума, для меня большая честь от имени председателя Торгово-промышленной палаты сегодня поделиться видением бизнес-сообщества в той тематике, которую мы обсуждаем. В первую очередь, открытость экономической политики руководства Узбекистана подтверждается выступлением уважаемого заместителя премьер-министра, когда он говорит о тех направлениях, которые многие десятилетия, скажем прямо, были закрыты, были терра инкогнито. Это приватизация основных экономикообразующих предприятий нашей страны, имея в виду энергетический, газовый сектор и тем более, как уважаемый Jamshid начал, Новоинский горно-металлургический комбинат. Таким образом, на сегодня правительство демонстрирует открытость и прозрачность во всех этих направлениях. Говоря о бизнесе и особенно торгово-промышленной палате, нам приятно, что, Jamshid Анварович, вы упомянули внутренних инвесторов, то в данном случае постановление президента, которое мы сегодня обсуждаем, и мы стоим в ряде постановлений, которые будут запланированы еще по итогам этого форума, включены 556 предприятий государственных активов, но я хотел бы остановиться на тех, которые не 0,3 или 1, но в их перечне есть очень интересные крупные государственные активы. Это рекреационные зоны, зоны отдыха Бильдерсай, Чарвак, Сиджак, гостиничный комплекс Ичанкала. И они сейчас, благодаря тому, что за 5 лет в Узбекистане и внутренний инвестор, и предприниматель значительно вырос, они интересны и для наших отечественных предпринимателей также. В этом направлении я хотел бы остановиться на том, что вместе с агентством по управлению государственными активами постановлением инициировано президентом нашей страны создание бизнес-клиник. И говоря о открытости и прозрачности, нужно сказать, что в каждом регионе, в каждой области нашей страны, где региональные торгово-промышленные палаты и региональные управления под руководством господина Орtikова, мы создали бизнес-клиники совместно, потому что в большинстве из регионов они локализуются в зданиях торгово-промышленных палат регионов. И вы можете получить полную, открытую и прозрачную информацию и паспорта тех предприятий, которые планируются или которые уже выставлены на торги. Таким образом, я хотел бы сказать, что мы добились открытости и прозрачности, но в основном, конечно, мы использовали международный опыт, и в этом, конечно, роль тех организаций, финансовых корпораций, таких международных организаций, как UNDP, Международный валютный фонд, банков и Bjerde, Азиатский банк развития, Международные финансовые корпорации, ОСР и других очень важны были. И Jamshid уже упомянул 2 советников. Для меня была большая честь работать несколько дней в Польше, где очень хороший опыт приватизации. Господин Качмарик, я думаю, сегодня поделится в рамках этого форума своим видением успешной приватизации такой страны, как Польша. Я хотел бы остановиться на том, что нам нужно сделать в дальнейшем. Господин Кучкаров уже сказал, что нам нужна законодательная база, и экспертный совет с широким вовлечением бизнес-сообщества будет хорошим подспорьем. Второе, то, что нам очень нужно, это знания, которых нам очень недостает на этапах как приватизации, так и последующего менеджмента этих компаний. И сегодня мы бы планировали бы, чтобы очень большое количество консалтинговых негосударственных компаний, как в Узбекистане, так и международных, помогли нашим предпринимателям на всех этапах от приобретения государственных активов и дальнейшего эффективного менеджмента, потому что мы все понимаем, что частный сектор лучше обеспечит управление этими активами в большинстве своем, но для этого ему нужны знания. Третье, что очень важно, это, конечно, дальнейшее усиление законотворческой деятельности о том, чтобы не было сомнений ни у иностранного инвестора, ни у локального инвестора в том, что то, что он приобрел у государства, это будет его собственностью. Поэтому право собственности, как выступал второй уважаемый спикер Анна Бьерде, она должна быть во главе угла. Я хотел бы быть уверенным, что в повестке дня уважаемые наши спикеры включили эти все вопросы, и следующие форумы просил бы обеспечить с большим участием бизнес-сообщества, которое тоже очень ждет такого рода дискуссий и тоже имеет сейчас свой голос за те годы последние, когда мы с большим вниманием относимся к частному бизнесу и предпринимательству. Желаю всем участникам форума успехов и плодотворных дискуссий. Спасибо.
Thank you, Mr. Ikramov. Now we have the pleasure of hearing from Mr. Akmalkhon Ortikov, who is the director of the State Assets Management Agency. But before we hear from Mr. Ortikov, we are going to watch a new video that's been prepared to introduce the mission and role of UzSAMA, I should say, in the privatization process.
Located at the crossroads of Eurasia, Uzbekistan connects the largest economic zones in the world. With a population of 34 million people, Uzbekistan has caught the attention of international investors for its sound economic policies and robust economic growth. In recent years, Uzbekistan's development has been characterized by major economic reforms. These reforms include efforts to reduce the role of the state in Uzbekistan's economy in order to create a more diversified, prosperous market. In 2019, President Mirziyoyev assigned the State Assets Management Agency, known as UzSAMA, a critical mission to oversee the transformation and privatization of state assets and enterprises. As it pursues this mission, UzSAMA has 3 priorities: ensure the effective management and corporate governance of state assets, encourage transformation and innovation in line with global economic trends, manage the sale of state assets to local and international investors. UzSAMA is working closely with a wide range of stakeholders to improve its management capacities. The agency is adopting global best practices in management, governance, and financial oversight. In 2021, UzSAMA announced that the government of Uzbekistan would be selling its shares in a wide range of companies and properties, including some of the most famous and commercially successful industrial enterprises in the country, to ensure the trust of both the Uzbek public as well as local and foreign investors. UzSAMA is committed to transparency and direct communication. Our objective is not just to prepare assets for privatization, but to ensure the growth and sustainability of formerly state-owned enterprises with a long-term outlook. We aim to deliver greater prosperity for future generations, ensuring economic development that respects workers, communities, and the environment. UzSAMA is a visionary asset manager and a trusted government institution. We work today to build a better future for Uzbekistan tomorrow.
Assalomu alaykum, hurmatli xonimlar va janoblar. Ushbu forumimiz xalqaro forum ekanligini va ko'plab bizni chet eldan ishtirokchilarimiz borligini inobatga olgan holda ruxsat bersanglar, o'z ma'ruzamni rus tilida davom ettiraman. Добрый день, уважаемые участники и гости форума, уважаемый Jamshid Anvarovich, уважаемая госпожа Анна Bjerde, дамы и господа. Позвольте еще раз поприветствовать вас на сегодняшнем мероприятии, организованном Агентством по управлению госактивами совместно с Всемирным банком. Мне доставляет большое удовольствие и интерес общественности к данному форуму, а также весомость его участников. Как вам известно, в послании уважаемого президента Республики Узбекистан Шавката Мирамоновича Мирзиёева Олий Маджлису и народу Узбекистана 29 декабря 2020 года одними из приоритетных направлений структурных преобразований страны были определены ускорение трансформации госкомпаний, приватизация, а также сокращение участия государства в экономике. Прежде всего, хотел бы обратить ваше внимание на следующее. Высокий уровень участия государства в экономике препятствует развитию здоровой конкурентной среды. Без осуществления прозрачного процесса приватизации мы не сможем завоевать доверие отечественных и иностранных инвесторов. Не осуществив меры по трансформации госпредприятий, не сможем повысить их привлекательность. В качестве примера могу отметить, что в настоящее время практически каждый госорган и органы местной власти являются учредителями госпредприятий. Так, число предприятий с госучастием на сегодняшний день составляет более 2500, из которых половина созданы в форме унитарного предприятия. Подавляющее большинство предприятий с госучастием являются неэффективными, что еще раз подтверждает то, что государство не является хорошим менеджером. Агентством госактивов были впервые опубликованы в апреле месяце итоги о финансовых результатах предприятий с наибольшей чистой прибылью и наибольшими убытками за 2020 год. Следует отметить, что присутствие государства в экономике республики по-прежнему остается высоким и составляет около 50%. К примеру, в Южной Корее этот показатель составляет 22%, Германия 18%, США 11% и Япония 5%. В этой связи разработана стратегия по управлению и реформированию предприятий с госучастием на 2021-2025 годы, которая утверждена правительством в марте этого года. Уважаемые участники форума, пользуясь случаем, хотел бы я выразить особую признательность команде Европейского банка реконструкции и развития за их активное участие в разработке данной стратегии, а также компании Nestor Advisors, которая участвовала в разработке концепции документа и сопровождала до ее принятия. Также хотел поблагодарить команду Всемирного банка и АБР, которые представили свои ценные рекомендации по проекту. В рамках принятой стратегии планируется осуществить следующие меры. Первое. Сократить количество госпредприятий путем определения критериев ограничения участия государства в сферах, где и так развита конкуренция и успешно функционирует частный сектор. Используя принцип «продай или объясни», при отсутствии обоснований по сохранению предприятия оно подлежит ликвидации, преобразованию или реализации. Во-вторых, будет обновлена нормативно-правовая база в сфере приватизации, управления и реформирования госпредприятий путем разработки проектов закона Республики Узбекистан об управлении государственным имуществом и проекта закона о приватизации новой редакции. Действующий закон о разгосударствлении и приватизации был принят еще в 1991 году и нуждается в существенной доработке в соответствии с современными требованиями и реалиями. В настоящее время проекты разработаны при содействии международных институтов и зарубежных экспертов. До конца текущего года агентством госактивов будут приняты меры по их внесению в законодательную палату Оли Маджлиса. В-третьих, государство не будет создавать новые госпредприятия без надлежащего обоснования. При этом все действующие унитарные предприятия будут поэтапно преобразованы или ликвидированы. Могу отметить, что в кратчайшее время вы увидите первые результаты с реализации стратегии в части поэтапной реорганизации и ликвидации порядка 600 госпредприятий. В-четвертых, будет отменена практика предоставления эксклюзивных льгот и преференций, а также госгарантий для финансирования инвестиционных и иных проектов госпредприятий. В-пятых, будут внедряться современные методы корпоративного управления и отменено специальное право участия государства в госпредприятиях, так называемая «золотая акция». В-шестых, деятельность органов управления и контроля предприятия с госучастием будет организована в соответствии с лучшей практикой корпоративного управления. В частности, начиная со следующего года будет внедрена практика избрания кандидатов в наблюдательные советы на конкурсной основе. Доля независимых членов наблюдательных советов к 2025 году будет доведена до 30%. Исполнительный орган также будет формироваться на конкурсной основе со сроком полномочий до 3 лет. Оценка деятельности членов наблюдательного совета и исполнительного органа будет увязана с показателями корпоративного управления и ключевыми показателями эффективности. Исходя из поставленных задач, по итогам реализации стратегии до 2005 года будет поэтапно сокращено на 75% количество госпредприятий. Совместно с Министерством финансов будет обеспечено публичное размещение акций госпредприятий через первичное IPO и вторичное SPO предложений. Будет привлечено около 100 иностранных менеджеров в органы управления госпредприятий. Позвольте также остановиться по вопросам приватизации. Выше упомянул уважаемый Jamshid Анварович, поэтому я вкратце буду рассказывать. Как вам известно, указом президента Республики Узбекистан, принятым в октябре 2020 года о мерах по ускоренному реформированию предприятий с участием государства и приватизации государственных активов, внедрены ряд новшеств, в том числе впервые определен перечень предприятий, подлежащих трансформации. Отменена практика реализации гособъектов по нулевой выкупной стоимости. Утверждены перечни госпредприятий и объектов недвижимости, подлежащих приватизации. Хочу особо отметить, что указом президента Республики Узбекистан от 11 февраля текущего года начата практика внедрения современных методов приватизации. частности, в процесс приватизации начали привлекаться профессиональные организации, отменено требование об обязательном установлении оценочной стоимости госактива как стартовая цена. При этом оценочная стоимость является ориентиром для реализации объекта. К концу первой половины этого года ожидается продажа более 550 активов, в том числе таких крупных имущественных комплексов, как бизнес-центр Пойтах, торговый центр Малика, гостиница Ичанкала, административное здание в центре города Ташкента. До конца года планируем реализовать, как выше упомянули, госдоли в Узагроэкспортбанке и Пойтахтбанке. В предприятиях Ферганский нефтеперерабатывающий завод, предприятие Кварц, страховой компании Кафолат, виноводочных и масложировых предприятиях. Для определения рыночной стоимости госактивов нами привлекаются международно признанные оценочные компании, такие как KPMG, Deloitte, PricewaterhouseCoopers, Grant Thornton и другие, которые осуществляют процесс оценки. Предприватизационная подготовка также осуществляется международно признанными консалтинговыми компаниями. В завершение хотел бы еще раз поблагодарить всех участников и гостей за принятие участия в работе данного форума. Убежден, что продуктивные дискуссии и конструктивный обмен мнениями, опытом и лучшей практикой позволят его участникам разработать практические рекомендации в области управления, реформирования и приватизации госпредприятий во благо развития Республики Узбекистан. Благодарю за внимание. Спасибо.
Thank you, Mr. Ortikov. It's fantastic to hear that this roadmap is taking shape and that the implementation of these ambitious sort of set of privatizations is about to be underway. But we have an opportunity now to look back at another example of privatization to learn lessons from it. And I'm delighted to introduce Mr. Martin Razer, who's country director for China at the World Bank. And as Ms. Bjerde mentioned earlier, Mr. Razer brings some particular insights about how these processes succeeded and where there were challenges in the Chinese case. Mr. Razer, I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, Isfandyar. Deputy Prime Minister Kuchkarov, Minister Ishmetov, Chairman Ortikov, dear guests and World Bank colleagues, it's really a great pleasure to be speaking to you, my old friends in Uzbekistan, on the topic of SOE reform. This topic is one that accompanied me throughout my professional career. And as you know, I started my career in the World Bank 18 years ago as the country manager for Uzbekistan. So this is really a wonderful way to bridge almost 20 years of professional life and development. I want to make 3 points in my brief address this afternoon. The first, I want to speak briefly about what we've learned in general from the past 3 decades of SOE reform and privatization. Second, I want to say a word about the experience in China and what other countries, including Uzbekistan, could learn from it. And then I want to briefly address the interaction of SOE reform and privatization with other policy fields, including budget policy and social policy. To my first point, I wrote my PhD more than 25 years ago on the question of how to improve the performance of state enterprises and transition economies, with a focus on the phenomenon that is often called the soft budget constraint, which made the effort to improve performance of state enterprises elusive in the decades running up to the fall of the Berlin Wall. And my conclusion at the time was that changes in ownership structure alone would not suffice to harden budget constraints. And thus privatization was no panacea for achieving improvements in enterprise performance. I also found that in some countries like Poland, which had delayed the mass privatization of state enterprises, the performance nonetheless improved as budget constraints were hardened and their managers and workers were given the right incentives. And finally, my PhD included a chapter comparing experiences in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union to those in China, which highlighted how in China, the emergence of township and village enterprises, which were new mixed ownership enterprises mostly in the countryside, particularly among the rapidly growing and reforming coastal provinces, created competitive pressures that led to improvements in SOE performance as well. While in the northeastern provinces, the dominant SOEs faced little competition and as a result, little pressure to reform. One could say that the coastal provinces in China looked a little bit like Poland, and the Northeast looked a bit more like Ukraine. I believe the lessons from a quarter of a century ago still hold today, and I would summarize them as follows. First, ownership reform on their own are no guarantee for improved performance of enterprises. Private owners will have an incentive to improve the performance of their companies when they operate in competitive markets, and when the return to managerial effort is higher than the return to political lobbying. Second, incentives for better governance and as a result improved enterprise performance can be introduced into state enterprises as well. Sound auditing and financial reporting standards help, as does the clear separation of regulatory and ownership functions and the introduction of independent directors on governance boards. Third, governments often hold on to state enterprises for a variety of reasons. Unless these reasons are clearly articulated and the financial obligations and benefits associated with delivering on policy objectives beyond the maximization of profit are transparently budgeted and reported, incentives for strong performance management are diluted and the results may end up falling short on all of the objectives. These lessons bring me to my second point, the experience of China. China began the process of enterprise reform with the introduction of corporate management incentives and SOEs under the so-called contract responsibility system, whereby enterprise managers were given some flexibility to trade inputs and outputs above planned quota on the market. While these reforms improved SOE performance somewhat, it became increasingly clear by the late 1980s that SOEs were a cause of significant financial distortions and risks. As a result, in the following decade, in preparation for WTO accession in 2001, China embarked on a more aggressive SOE reform strategy called letting go of the weak and holding on to the strong. The result was a substantial shrinkage of the public sector by the late 1990s through the privatization or liquidation of numerous smaller state enterprises. China's dynamic post-WTO accession growth allowed the resulting millions of redundant workers to be quickly reabsorbed, and this was a huge advantage over comparable experiences in Eastern Europe. Then, in 2003, China created the State Asset Management Company, SASAC, with the objective of improving SOE profitability and introducing sound governance principles. In recent years, SASAC has encouraged the sale of partial ownership stakes in their portfolio to private investors through IPOs in an effort to further increase market discipline. While SOE profitability improved in the 2000s, it declined in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, when SOEs were used as the main vehicle to finance and implement China's unprecedented fiscal stimulus. More recently, attention has again shifted towards strengthening financial discipline and raising profitability of SOEs with mixed results. China's experience holds some important lessons, particularly with respect to the management of a large portfolio of state assets under a government holding company. China still maintains a much more significant share of state ownership in the economy than most OECD countries, for example. Despite the introduction of independent directors, improved financial reporting, and stock market listing, SASAC has found it difficult to execute a completely arm's-length ownership model. Indeed, the government frequently intervenes in operational decision-making of state enterprises, undermining the independence of management and the functioning of the board. Perhaps the biggest challenges for China has been the lack of a clear ownership policy. In principle, China distinguishes between strategic and commercial state enterprises, but the government has yet to publish a clear list of which company belongs in which category. Overlapping policy and commercial objectives dilute management performance incentives, while public service obligations are not made explicit or not remunerated through the budget, but through preferential access to land and credit. This has led to the perpetuation of soft budget constraints for state enterprises and accounts for their weaker profitability relative to private sector companies. And this brings me to my final point. Because governments may use state enterprises for a variety of objectives, to generate employment and implement stimulus policies, for example, or to help finance local government infrastructure when budget resources fall short, or to support strategic industrial policy objectives, and these objectives interfere with the profit motive, it is critical to view state enterprise reform in the context of other state policies. If local budgets do not have other resources to fund necessary public investments, local government officials will be reluctant to let go of their SOEs. If social policies are not in place to support the reallocation of workers from privatized or liquidated state companies, public resistance may derail the reforms. And of course, examples abound of state enterprise managers abusing industrial policy objectives for rent seeking, undermining both enterprise performance and the objectives of the policy itself. Deputy Prime Minister Kuchkarov, ladies and gentlemen, my colleagues have told me about the ambitious SOE reforms you're in the middle of implementing. From what you've told me today and what I've seen of the design of the policies, you're clearly aware of the pitfalls and are carefully sequencing your steps. You started with selling and liquidating the small, then now evaluating and triaging the bigger firms before finding strategic investors to buy them, and finally developing a clear state ownership and asset management policy for those companies that will remain in your hands. Implementation challenges abound, and the very successful example of China shows that even successful countries have important implementation challenges. But I'm impressed with your commitment, and I wish you the very best of success in implementation. I hope I'll soon have a chance to visit you again, as I did last year, to accompany the progress in your reforms. Best of luck to you all, and thank you for this invitation.
Thank you, Martin. An excellent message on why the approach has to be holistic. And one of the things that Mr. Ortikov mentioned was the need to look at the legislation that will enable these reforms. And we're fortunate today to have a member of the Oily Majlis, a legislator here in Uzbekistan, Mr. Donyar Ganiev. And I'm now going to turn the floor over to him for a few short comments about exactly how the legislative chambers in this country are viewing the mission ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Isfander. Good afternoon, dear ladies and gentlemen, distinguished speakers. Before I start, I would like to thank organizers of this forum, especially State Asset Management Agency, for the invitation. I have prepared my notes in Uzbek, so if you allow me, I'll continue in Uzbek. Iqtisodiyotda limon sotsializmi degan bir tushuncha bor. Ya'ni agar ishlar yomon ketadigan bo'lsa, xarajatlar soliq to'lovchilarning zimmasiga o'tadi. Ammo ishlar yaxshi ketsa, aksiyadorlar yoki manfaatdor shaxslar, guruhlar foydani o'zlariga olishadi. Ya'ni sodda qilib aytganda, daromadlar xususiylashtiriladi, zararlar esa umumlashtiriladi. Bu misol keltirishdan maqsad shuki, men afsuski uzoq yillar davomida va hozirda ham aytish mumkin, davlat ulushidagi ko'plab korxonalarimiz aynan shu limon sotsializm tamoyili asosida ishlab kelishmoqda. Garchi bu korxonalar mamlakat yalpi ichki mahsulotini yarmini tashkil qilsa-da, ularning juda ko'pi samarasiz faoliyat ko'rsatadi. Ular davlat uchun qo'shimcha yuk bo'ladi hamda ularga berilgan soliq va boshqa imtiyozlar sababli ular iqtisodiyotda raqobat muhitiga salbiy ta'sir ko'rsatishadi. Qolaversa, shu butun dunyo tajribasidan yaxshi ma'lumki, korxonalarni boshqarishda davlat hech qachon yaxshi menejer yoki tadbirkor bo'lmaydi. Shu ma'noda aytish mumkinki, hurmatli prezidentimiz Shavkat Miromonovich Mirziyoyevni 2020-yil 29-dekabrda O'zbekiston Respublikasi Oliy Majlisiga yo'llagan murojaatnomalarida aynan iqtisodiyotda davlat ishtirokini keskin qisqartirish, davlat aktivlarini xususiylashtirish va transformatsiya jarayonlarini amalga oshirishni ustuvor vazifa etib belgilaganlari bejizga emas. Chunki davlat korxonalarini xususiylashtirish orqaligina yuqorida sanab o'tilgan muammolarni bartaraf etish, bozorda sog'lom raqobat muhitini shakllantirish, investorlarni ushbu korxonalarda yanada samarali faoliyat yuritishi hamda byudjetga soliq ko'rinishida ko'proq daromad olish maqsad qilingan. Qayd etish joizki, bugunga kelib xususiylashtirish jarayonlari birinchi navbatda davlat va xalq manfaatlarini ko'zlab, shuningdek shaffof va raqobat tamoyillari asosida jarayondagi barcha manfaatdor tomonlar, jumladan iste'molchilar, yetkazib beruvchilar, hamkorlar, investorlarning manfaatlarini inobatga olgan holda hamda ilg'or xorijiy tajribani o'zlashtirish asosida olib borilishiga agentlik tomonidan alohida e'tibor berilmoqda. Lekin shu bilan birga tan olib aytish lozimki, jarayonda bir qator muammo va kamchiliklar ham kuzatilmoqda. Ruxsatingiz bilan ushbu kamchiliklarni ba'zilariga to'xtalib o'tsam. Birinchidan, bir qator spikerlarimiz, jumladan Jamshid ham e'tirof etgandek, xususiylashtirish jarayonini samarali, tizimli va aniq talablar asosida amalga oshirilishini ta'minlash va jarayondagi munosabatlarni huquqiy tartibga solish maqsadida qonunchilik bazasini mustahkamlash muhimdir. Men afsuski, hozirda davlat aktivlarini xususiylashtirish jarayonini tashkiliy huquqiy asosdan belgilab beruvchi amaldagi qonunimiz 1991-yilda qabul qilingan. Tabiiyki, ushbu qonunning ko'plab normalari yuqorida Jamshid misol keltirgandek, bugungi zamonaviy bozor munosabatlariga mos kelmayapti va natijada bu munosabatlarning juda ko'pi qonun osti hujjatlari bilan tartibga solinmoqda. Ma'lumki, prezidentimiz 2020-yil 27-oktyabrdagi 60-96 farmonlarida ham aynan davlat mulkini boshqarish to'g'risidagi va xususiylashtirish to'g'risidagi O'zbekiston Respublikasi qonun loyihalarini ishlab chiqish belgilangan. Dastlab farmonda bu muddat 2020-yil 1-dekabrda belgilangan bo'lsa-da, keyinchalik bu muddat 2021-yil 1-dekabrga ko'chirildi. Shu bois biz xohlardikki, hukumat tomonidan ushbu qonun loyihalarini ishlab chiqishni tezlashtirish va eng muhimi bu loyihani keng jamoatchilik muhokamasidan o'tkazish va Oliy Majlis Qonunchilik palatasiga ko'rib chiqish uchun kiritish lozim. Va mana shu qonun loyihalarida davlat mulklarini xususiylashtirishning aniq mexanizmlari, jumladan ularni baholash, ommaviy savdoga chiqarish yoki sotish mezonlari, jarayonni shaffoflashtirish, vakolatli organni huquq va majburiyatlari, shuningdek davlat aktivlari sotilayotgan yoki ishonchli boshqaruvga berilayotgan kompaniyalarga qo'yilayotgan talab va tamoyillarni belgilash zarur. Va eng muhimi, aynan mana shu qonun loyihalari ishlab chiqilib qabul qilingunga qadar yirik aktivga ega strategik korxonalarni xususiylashtirish jarayonini to'xtatib turish to'g'ri deb o'ylayman. Ikkinchi muhim masala xususiylashtirish jarayonini xolis va shaffofligini ta'minlash hisoblanadi. Lekin men afsuski amaliyotda ko'ryapmizki, ba'zi hollarda mana shu davlat aktivlarini xususiylashtirgan yoki ishonchli boshqaruvga olgan investor, tadbirkorlar aslida hech kim tanimaydigan, ochilganiga 3-4 yil bo'lgan yoki sohada hech qanday tajribaga ega bo'lmagan, offshor hududlarda ro'yxatdan o'tgan shubhali kompaniyalar bo'lib chiqayotgan yoki xususiylashtirishga oid jamoatchilik savollari javobsiz, bee'tibor qolilayotgani haqli ravishda jamoatchilikni e'tirozlariga sabab bo'lmoqda va eng achinarlisi jarayonga nisbatan ishonchsizlik hissini uyg'otmoqda. Shu bois davlat aktivlarini xususiylashtirish jarayonlarida shaffoflik va oshkoralikka erilishda jamoatchilik ishtirokini ta'minlash, jarayon ustidan jamoatchilik nazoratini o'rnatish va kuchaytirish mexanizmlarini kengaytirish, xususiylashtirish jarayoni bilan bog'liq masalalar, uning natijalari yuzasidan parlament va jamoatchilikka doimiy axborot, hisobot berishni yo'lga qo'yish zarur. Yana bir taklif bo'lardi, aynan o'sha davlat rahbarining 60-96 sonli farmonida davlat aktivlarini sotish bo'yicha maxsus komissiya belgilangan. Va mana shu komissiyaga jamoatchilik nazoratini kuchaytirish va aholida olib borilayotgan xususiylashtirish jarayonlariga nisbatan ishonch hissini uyg'otish maqsadida jamoatchilik vakillarini qo'shishni taklif qilgan bo'lardim. Uchinchidan, mamlakat iqtisodiyotida strategik o'rin tutuvchi hamda yirik aktivlarga ega korxonalarni xususiylashtirish kichik korxonalar va bo'sh turgan binolarni sotishdan tubdan farq qiladi. Chunki bunday korxonalar ortidan iqtisodiyotning muhim sektorlari, 10 minglab ish o'rinlar taqdiri, davlat byudjetiga milliardlab soliq tushumlari yotadi. Shu bois ushbu yirik korxonalarni xususiylashtirish yoki sotish jarayoniga ilg'or xorijiy tajribani qo'llash, xalqaro moliya institutlari va ekspertlar tomonidan ishlab chiqilgan taklif va tavsiyalar asosida bu korxonalarni eng samarali boshqara oladigan, uning resurslaridan unumli foydalanadigan va uni eng ko'p qadrlaydigan ochiq tadbirkor investorlarga ochiq va shaffof mexanizm orqali berishga erishishimiz lozim. To'rtinchidan, xususiylashtirishdan kelib tushadigan mablag'lar masalasi. Bunda kelib tushgan mablag'lardan samarali foydalanishga erishish, ularni birinchi navbatda muhim ijtimoiy, iqtisodiy loyihalarga, byudjet xarajatlarini amalga oshirishga yo'naltirish hamda eng muhimi bu jarayonda oshkoralik va shaffoflikni ta'minlash Mablag'lar hisobiga amalga oshirilgan ishlar bo'yicha ma'lumotlarni doimiy ravishda keng jamoatchilikka e'lon qilinishini yo'lga qo'yish lozim. Xulosa o'rnida aytish mumkinki, davlat nazorati va egalligi ostida bo'lgan iqtisodiyot bilan iqtisodiy o'sishni, taraqqiyotni ta'minlab bo'lmasligini o'zimizni achchiq tajribamizda ko'rdik va hamon ko'rmoqdamiz. Lekin eng muhimi va quvonarlisi shuki, vaziyatni o'nglash uchun iqtisodiyotni davlat yukidan xalos etish yo'lida davlatimiz rahbari tashabbusi va siyosiy irodasi bilan katta qadamlar qo'yilib, bugun bir qator ijobiy islohotlar boshlandi. Endigi qadam o'ylaymanki, aynan mana shu boshlangan islohotlarni izchil davom ettirish, o'tmish xatolarni takrorlamasdan mana shu xususiylashtirish jarayonini imkon qadar xato va nuqsonlardan va eng muhimi korrupsiyadan xoli amalga oshirish kerak. Va bunda bu orqali mamlakat iqtisodiyotini va aholi farovonligini oshirish o'ylaymanki, ham hukumatni, ham parlamenti va keng jamoatchilik oldida turgan ustuvor vazifa bo'lishi kerak. Nima bo'lgan taqdirda ham bir narsani ishonch bilan aytishim mumkinki, iqtisodiyotda davlat ulushini qisqartirish va xususiylashtirish jarayonini jadallashtirish nafaqat bu yil, balki kelgusi yillarda ham keng jamoatchilik hamda xalqaro ekspertlarning e'tibori markazida turadigan voqelik bo'lib qoladi. Shu nuqtadan kelib chiqib, men bugungi forum tashkilotchilariga yana bir bor o'zim minnatdorchiligimni bildiraman va barcha forum ishtirokchilariga omad tilayman. E'tiboringiz uchun rahmat.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ganiyev. And your speech just now actually answered a question from a member of our audience about the type of oversight role that the parliamentarians plan to take here in Uzbekistan. And I would just remind members of our audience online that you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit questions. We're moving into the moderated discussion section of the event, and in the last panel in particular, we will do our best to get to some of those questions if they have not been answered already. But now, our first panel discussion, and it's my opportunity to introduce Ms. Andrea Marusic, who is the senior private sector specialist at the World Bank, and she is joining us virtually to moderate this panel. Andrea, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone. I'm honored to be part of a World Bank team that is supporting the government of Uzbekistan in SOE reforms and privatization. I am myself from a country that has been, let's say, an active participant in the wave of privatization in the early 2000s. I'm from Serbia, and while privatization did indeed fulfill on its expectations, there were bumps on the road. And this is indeed the objective of this session, to look at what a roadmap would be, so that we know where these bumps are and how important it is to be prepared to overcome them. So who better to give us such a roadmap than our panel today? It is my honor to present our speakers for today. We have Mr. Akmalkhon, who is advisor to the chairman of the State Assets Management Agency. We have Professor Ira Lieberman, who is president and CEO of LIPAM International and has really an incredible experience in this area, in privatization, in economic transformation in many countries, including Central and Eastern Europe. I'm afraid that I cannot do him justice in this presentation, so Ira, feel free to add on your experience. He has advised several governments on privatization. He also has a number of prominent publications, of which maybe one I would mention in particular, which is Privatization in Transition Economies, the ongoing story. Whoever is involved as a policymaker in this area should really look at it. And last but not least, we have Ms. Matilda Dimovska, who is UNDP resident representative in Uzbekistan. She took this role in 2019, and prior to this, she served many other roles at the UNDP in Turkey, Moldova, Georgia. She also had a prominent role in privatization in her own country, where she served as the chairman of the board of the Macedonian Privatization Agency. Just before we dive into the discussion, I also wanted to acknowledge that questions are coming in through the Q&A function, some of them from private sector representatives, which is very encouraging. So keep them coming. We will take note of them for sure. So let me hand it over to Mr. Akram Muhammadkulov to kick us off in this session. Akram, over to you.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Dear distinguished guests, dear participants of the forum, and members of the business community of Uzbek government, Mr. Chairman Ortikov, Mr. Minister Ishmetov, Mr. Montanavelli, it's a great pleasure to address you all today. I will speak in English, and my short intervention will be complementing Director Ortikov's speech in the sense that on more, I will try to raise some more technical level issues that we face, and our team that sits behind me and beside me in terms of privatization of state assets and what sort of challenges we are currently facing that will probably reverberate with my distinguished panelists and also experienced practitioners from other countries, so that we reconcile a bit what challenges we're facing, and then to try to find some solutions and some ways and recommendations for the future for the agency. I won't say much, but I think my colleague parliamentarian Ganiyev already said that we don't have unified legislation. Our law from 1991 on nationalization and privatization is quite outdated. It doesn't have the platform, legal platform that will allow us to perform our functions up to the modern kind of expected known procedures for privatization that usually our consultants, that most of them are present here, advise us. So it's critical that we have that law adopted by the parliament this year, later this year. In terms of frequent problem that we're facing is that our valuation of companies, so state-owned companies, are quite overvalued, which makes the price pretty prohibitive and makes the asset sort of less attractive. So the agency, we have adopted the national standards for valuation, which are now being reviewed by the agency, and we have announced a request for interest on looking at these standards to bring them along the line of international standards. And we would like to thank our colleagues at IBL that will be funding this project whereby we attract foreign consultants. We've also faced quite a bit of issues in terms of methodologies of privatization. You do understand, and also Director Ortikov just said that this process has just started. We are being exposed to various forms of privatization from abroad. Most of our consultants, like, correct me if I'm wrong, they lean more towards mergers and acquisitions. That's because our capital markets is not up to scratch yet, and our banking sector isn't really participating yet. I mean, most of our banks are 5% the government, so they need to be privatized first as well. So we're still expecting a wave of foreign investment banks that will participate. We have Rothschilds at Coca-Cola, but we definitely we need more. So that brings us sort of a limited kind of platform of how we can privatize these assets. And for instance, there are some other forms that our consultants also tell us, like management buyouts, etc. But further down the road, we are expecting that we will diversify our sort of selling methods. We know that the Ministry of Finance is putting a lot of effort into developing our capital markets. So we will be working hand in hand with the ministry and with the department, now respective department. You know that according to the strategy, quite a bit of assets will be put up for IPO and SPO. So we do need to keep that in mind for our future deals. Director Ortikov mentioned that we have 18 companies that were put up for sale. We have a specialized agency, specialized company at the under the UzSAMA, so UzAssets investment company. It is being developing, let's say, necessary expertise through exposure to our foreign consultants. I have to tell you that in my 1 year at the agency, I was amazed by how much work it is that the guys do here. And I mean, a bit of patience is needed, but in terms of sort of proper specialists that would hold the ground with very experienced consultants, we don't have many yet. but that experience is growing, and our specialists, they get exposure to sort of proper high level sort of consulting services, also through due diligence reports and all the procedures that need to be taken into account when we think about selling of state assets, right? Just want to spice up a bit. I would say that privatization is a very difficult area to work in. I would say it's like riding a bus and then changing like a windscreen and then the wheels on the way full of people. And the people also want to know exactly what's happening, and it has to be open. So we are aware that the wider civil society and media, everybody wants to know what exactly is happening in each of the deals. You know that a lot of deals are actually confidential, not to affect the process of the bidders, and then they also don't want this process to be very open. So we're trying to do our best. My colleague, Mr. Ganiyev, also mentioned that we have to do it quite openly. We are fully aware of that, and our team is fully aware. One more thing is that time is a very limited resource. Sometimes we need to really speed up our given procedures. There's certain time that is needed for due diligence, for marketing of the event, for sounding investors, for conducting negotiations. Sometimes we don't really have that much time, but our consultants are pretty aware of these challenges. I would say that one particular aspect is that we're still lacking is legal expertise. That's quite a specific area where we do rely on our consultants and foreign partners. Through IBL, we've recently announced a request for interest for hiring a legal firm that will give us another layer of necessary in-house legal expertise that would kind of support us in terms of legal issues that we're facing. You can be fully aware that a lot of these state-owned enterprises have quite a few legal issues that we're trying to solve along the way. So it's quite challenging. We must say that the companies, some of the bigger companies, they are actually like city-forming enterprises. They have sometimes the people have emotional attachments to them. They're not particularly profitable anymore, but that kind of social responsibility is upon the privatizers when they sell the enterprises. So privatization is not a straightforward like M&A transaction. We really need to think about particular social aspects of this or that enterprise, and then discuss with the investors of what they will do with that enterprise, how that will affect the community, how that will affect the personnel. One thing is clear, that there is political will to privatize. A lot of deals are in the pipeline. We're working really hard on them. There is a growing, hopefully, wider understanding from the general public why we need to privatize, because we need to reduce the role of the economy. And on behalf of the agency, we're committed to this process and doing it openly, efficiently, and very effectively. So I'll probably end there. Thank you very much, Andrea. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Akram. I think you gave us a lot of food for thought and incredible, insightful, actually observations, and you really, hit the nail right on the head. And I think it's a good task for our panelists now to see how the bus is going to proceed. I like the analogy with the bus. Let's see how we prevent the wheels from falling off. So over to you, Ira, for our first discussion.
Thank you very much, Andrea. And Akram, I think you hit a lot of the problems that countries face right away. So it's a pleasure to be with all of you today. I'm not sure I'm with you.
Yes, we can hear you well.
Okay, fine. Perhaps the place to start is objectives, and first I want to thank you for having me today and for being with this distinguished audience. And I've already learned a lot of what's going on. Perhaps the place to start is objectives. what objectives does the Uzbek government have for privatizing SOEs? Often governments have a long laundry list, some of which are direct consequences of privatization, and others the hope for economic and social impact of privatization. Some of these are improving productivity and efficiency of privatized firms and the economy more broadly, improving the quality of goods and services, reducing the state's role in the economy, the cost of subsidies, direct and implicit for SOEs, reducing the fiscal deficit, debt reduction through applying sales revenue to debt, promoting direct foreign investment, deepening domestic equity markets, boosting public confidence in a market economy, privatization as the first important step in restructuring loss-making SOEs. For me, I would boil down this long list of objectives that many governments have into three: getting government out of business to the fullest extent possible, and that means remaining in the end of the day with as few SOEs as possible. Martin Razer told you that China, despite years and years of privatizing, still has a very large SOE sector, and I think that is not serving it well. There are a lot of loss makers, and the banks are still reliant on subsidizing the SOEs. For me, so the first objective would be get government out of business to the full extent possible. The second would be generating new sources of cash flow and financing for these enterprises. But that is also going to mean that you need to privatize the banks and have a robust banking system, as Akram mentioned. Finally, is reducing fiscal deficits and debt by using sales revenue to retire domestic and external debt, the sales revenue from the sale of the SOEs from privatization, and used increased tax revenue from profitable privatized companies to reduce fiscal deficits. One of the sharpest debates on privatization in Eastern Europe and the CIS was about methods of privatization. Akram mentioned the issue faced. Poland, for example, which was my first client in the region on privatization, I started with the Polish Ministry of Privatization from the earliest days when I was at the World Bank. And Poland used a rich menu of privatization methods, including initial public offerings of their first 5 privatization transactions in order to kickstart its capital market. It used small-scale privatization, which almost every country in the region, and of course the Chinese did by town and village enterprises. They started a process called liquidation, which were essentially installment sales. And they also sold to workers and management through MIBOs, but also by bringing in a significant investor like a customer or a key supplier. Poland used MIBOs, management employee sales. Other countries, such as the Czech Republic, initially focused on small-scale privatization and mass privatization, but later sold important firms via trade sales. I would add to the list contracting out, usually contracts over a medium term, 5 to 10 years, used for shops and services at ports or airports, or services like peri-urban bus services. And finally, concessions used primarily for natural resources, such as for oil and gas exploration or utilities. Usually concessions are long-term, 15 to 20 years or longer. I understand that Uzbekistan is employing a diverse set of methods for privatizing its firms in its current program, including an auction platform for small and medium-sized firms, of which a number are to be privatized in 2021 on partial or minority share sales. and tenders or trade sales of larger firms. I think it is good to keep diverse methods, but to keep it down to a relatively short list on some fundamental principles, which I'll discuss now. Akram mentioned institutional capacity. It's very good that you've established UzSAMA as a privatization agency. This should work well if its responsibilities are clear, and the agency has adequate human capital and budgetary resources to manage the process. Privatization is an intensive and expensive process. The UzSAMA will need adequate human and budgetary resources to carry out privatization over what I think will take you some time to get done. In all the countries I worked on for the World Bank, we had a privatization technical assistance loan to back up privatization. I don't think there's one yet. I know there's a revolving loan for Uzbekistan, but Uzbekistan might want to give consideration to a privatization technical assistance loan to support UzSAMA's work. As I mentioned, it'll be critical for the government to privatize the banking sector because private sectors need a heterogeneous mix of financing. They need working capital, they need trade finance, they need long-term capital for plant and equipment, and this can only be done by a robust banking system. Most Central and Eastern European countries privatize up to 80% of their banking assets to European banks. External countries such as Mexico, Argentina, Turkey, and Korea all opened up their banking sectors to foreign banks following financial crises. I would advise the Uzbek government to begin the process now, though this is a very difficult time to sell a bank, but it takes time to prepare the banks for sale. One thing I would discourage is leaving the individual privatization or sale process in the hands of line ministries. The SOEs are the ministry's children and are often used for job patronage, to assume prestigious board roles, to compensate ministry staff, etc. Few line ministries willing to give up their children, so that the privatization process is often delayed or handled without transparency. It's very important that UzSAMA has direct control over the privatization process. Now, let me go quickly on to transformation, often called corporatization in the literature on privatization. Transformation is usually the first and very important start of the sales process. I realize that you have already begun transformation process, but let me emphasize its importance. This is especially important for large SOEs to be sold by trade sale or tender. Transformation converts the unitary form of SOE ownership to a limited liability or joint stock company. That allows the government to sell shares, but transformation should do more. It should be the time when external auditors either do an audit or a deep financial review of the company. You need a starting balance sheet for sale, and it's important to appraise the assets, including soft assets such as intellectual property rights, patents or copyrights, or proprietary technology. It's time to do a detailed accounting of liabilities, particularly medium and long-term debt due to the federal government, banks, or state-owned utilities. This is also a time when the government may need to think about consolidating or writing down debt so the entity is saleable. The government may also think about the social aspects of privatization during transformation, and it's time to take inventory of human sources, that is workers, considering necessary redundancies over time or at the time of sale. Advisors, I think there's all been adequate discussion on advisors, so I won't go much into that, but it's important that each large transaction have its own advisors. And Akram, I would say that it's very important that the advisory firm hire lawyers for each transaction, even though the government also needs its consortium of law firms to advise it. So if you have a large sale will require an investment advisor and often a legal firm to work with that investment advisor to handle the details of a sale. Sequencing and speed versus gradualism. Most early reform governments in the region moved to privatize quickly, thinking they could complete the process in 3 years or 4 years. Unfortunately, that was not the experience. Most governments quickly finished small-scale privatization, and I think Uzbekistan has largely been through that, although I understand there are small and medium-sized companies still involved in the auction process. But it's critical then to move on to the larger companies, and Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary handle the sale of telecom, gas, electricity, and large industrial companies, either by tender or IPO, which took several years to compete. Uzbekistan, we know, is now a lagging case and will still take a number of years to complete the privatization in larger cases. And that process normally cannot be rushed. It cannot be done too quickly. It is my understanding the government has drafted a privatization law, but as Akram mentioned, it has not been completed nor approved by the parliament. This is critical for the privatization process. And you not only need laws, but you need regulations for each type and each method of privatization that's to be used. The objective is to fully secure property rights and to assure transaction in the process. Also, it's very useful when the government is ready to do so to announce a privatization program by the implementing agency. This should be a 3 or 4 year program, which is revised annually. Restructuring pre or post-privatization. Many governments in the region tried large-scale restructuring prior to privatization. Hungary, Poland, Slovenia, and then Serbia all tried large-scale restructuring programs pursuant to privatization. Serbia, for example, had 79 large groups in its restructuring through privatization process. Most of these efforts did not succeed well. They basically slowed the process and failed to make the companies more valuable or attractive before privatization. I would advise the government to minimize restructuring to what we call defensive restructuring. That is reducing excess debt from the balance sheets and addressing social issues, essentially reducing excess staff. Very few buyers want to purchase a highly indebted company or one with excess staff. Let the buyers, the acquirers of the company, take care of what I would call positive restructuring, reorganizing the company, recruiting management, investing in technology, plant and equipment, modernizing products for sale, and expanding market and sales capacity, including exports as example. An exception are utilities. Normally, a sector like telecoms or electricity needs to be reorganized, and companies often split up, or like in electricity between primary transition of electricity, power generation, and distribution.
Maybe 1 minute.
Okay, let me talk briefly about minority shares and residual shares. I would encourage the government to privatize 100% as quickly as it can. I would not start with minority share sales. In a select number of companies, the government may want to hold on to 25% of shares for a limited period of time, let's say 3 to 5 years, or else hold a golden share, which would give it control or approval rights over critical transactions within the company, again, for a limit of 3 to 5 years. But holding residual shares in a lot of companies forces the government to reprivatize, and that's been a very expensive and long process and not very valuable in the end of the day. Finally, I will conclude by saying transparency, transparency, transparency. The government should be sure that it manages the process in a highly transparent way. This means having a published privatization program, means the retention of advisors. It means sales transactions should involve a competitive bidding process, the same for advisors. Tenders and trade sales should be announced and primarily be bid to a short list of qualified buyers on a best price basis. And governments are frequently accused of selling the family silver too cheaply or corruptly. Transparency will help you to the extent possible to keep it from politicizing the process and being accused of selling the family silver too cheaply or corruptly. So I would emphasize transparency above all. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Ira. This was incredibly rich. I think we have a lot of material here to expand on the discussion going forward as well. And we did answer some of the questions coming in online as well. I saw there was a question on do you recommend financial restructuring before privatization, which indeed we heard and are aligned in terms of being very careful about that. Let me now immediately turn it over to Ms. Matilda Dimovska, who is there in person. So Matilda, over to you. Hear a bit about your experience and in particular the Macedonian experience.
Rahmat Andrea, assalamu alaikum, hurmatli xonimlar va janoblar. Bugungi tadbirda ishtirok etish men uchun katta sharaf. Indeed, I am very pleased and honored to take part in this event. You know, every decade in the economic life of the world comes with a theme, the topic that determines the agenda of determines the decade, and for which probably the economists are not prepared always. But anyhow, the 19th of the last century was the decade of the transition, when many social countries, communist countries, moved to the market-based economy. And in the meantime, a wealth of privatization transition experience, because privatization was an essential key part of that transition process, was accumulated. For Uzbekistan, that was not part into that wave of transition at that time. Now it's really in a good situation. It has the opportunity to learn from that wealth of experience. Russia and Ukraine versus Poland or Estonia, or why not the countries that emerged from a former Yugoslavia. And I will speak about the Macedonian privatization experience, in which I was personally involved at different levels and very back in the past, and including as chair of the board of the directors of the privatization agency, the agency that was UzSAMA of the country at the time. So first about the background. I'm sure you know the country, but it was in 1991 when the independence was declared, and when the country decided that it will pursue the liberal multi-party democracy in the political life, that it will opt for an open market economy in the economic and then sphere, and then that it will respect freedoms and human rights as a social achievements. And early on, it was very clear that the transformation of the ownership will be crucial for the transition towards a free market economy. So that was one of the key priorities. In 1993, a decision has been made to dismantle what was inherited from former Yugoslavia, and that was a social capital. Now, I think that I need to spend a bit of one sentence about this ownership model, because it is different from what was dominant in most of the other former socialist countries, and I'm sure Andrea understands what I'm talking about. It's the fact that the enterprises were not owned by the state, but they were owned by the workers. It was ownership of everyone and no one. And it was the workers' council that were managing, representing the owner, while the management of the firms had a relatively good freedom to operate within the business environment. And that played a very important role. And it is different from the Uzbek model, where we have majority, of course, we talk about the state ownership. The second issue is that the market in former Yugoslavia was not fully restricted. In fact, there was quite a vibrant small market, private entrepreneurship spirit and managerial skills were allowed and nurtured throughout the time. And this is rather similar or to some extent similar to the case of Uzbekistan, where as I understand, in the post-independence period, private sector creation of it was allowed, even though rather regulated, and a second to the state-owned enterprises, which were given a lot of preferential position. Now, the point I wanted to make that in the case of former Yugoslavian country, in the case of my country, the challenge was not only to introduce a private ownership, the challenge was to introduce the concept of the ownership to start with, to move from this social everyone and no one ownership concept. And that determined the thinking and the approach of the privatization. So unlike in the other countries, the privatization and the need for it was recognized from the very beginning, but the ways of doing it was subject to a lot of debate. So the debates were whether it will be a vouchers ones based on the voucher system, like in Czech Republic, Poland, or only a paid privatization. And the question was also a lot of debate around how to involve citizens that are outside of the sectors that will be subject to privatizing. And that was again, this social responsibility and engagement of everyone, like the public administration, social sector workers, how they engage in this massive and important process. Now, many made the point, and I will repeat it from my experience, being very clear at the very beginning about the aim and the objectives of the process is extremely important. And given the context of my country, the key aim was first to nominate the owners, to get the owners, and then the objectives direct were, of course, to increase the consistency of the reforms and the efficiency of the economy, but as the secondary objectives or indirect, attract foreign capital, develop capital market and shareholding, reduce the internal and external debts, but also to encourage productive use of the available savings within the banking sector. And that was extremely important. And I think that similar are the objectives of Uzbekistan, as I see in the Uzbekistan development strategy and what I've heard today. Now, clarity of these objectives made it very easier after when that was set to decide on the privatization model, whether to go to the mass rapid privatization, insider privatization, or case by case paid privatization. And ultimately, the country chose to go for in between, probably, and it was a case by case commercial paid privatization, but with a preferred status and terms for the employees and the managers. All companies were commercial. Companies were subject to sale, evaluated, corporatized, as Mr. Lieberman was pointing, but it was a different point. And then 55% of their value was offered to equal terms to foreigners and foreign and domestic investors. That was extremely important. but very generous discounts were given to the employees. 30% of the value for initial with the initial 30% of discount and payment on installment. So that was the substitute of the voucher model in our case. And then different privatization models were allowed depending on the size of the company. Like for the small companies, employee buyout, middle were management or enterprise buyout, and so on. Those that were going up bankruptcy procedures were in a different methods privatized. Shares for additional issuance of shares for additional equity, debt equity swaps, a number of other models were applied. I refer to the most used ones. Now, what were the results and what worked well? In a period of around 12 years, the privatization of most of the commercial sector was done. And at the end, it was around 1.7 thousand enterprises, which accounted for 65% of the economic assets and employed around 60% of the employees were in a private ownership. And that was, from that perspective, the owner was nominated, the aim was achieved. And that was a very, very positive first step. But the consolidation of the ownership was about still to happen, and it was a next stage. So what did not work well? I think someone also mentioned that timing is essence. Yes, it is essence, and the duration that in Macedonian case was rather long, 12 years, was a result of the model that was case by case, that required a lot of preparation, evaluation, restructuring of the big enterprises. That took time, but also the decision that was made to involve employees and managers into the whole process. And the second big result is that most of the enterprises were sold to insiders. That was the result of the model that was applied. Because the workers and managers were permitted to decide on the model, they were giving the discounted approach, so and payment on installments. So therefore, the majority of companies were privatized under some internal insider buyout, while the forms of outsider privatization were still there, but were not dominant. There was a side effect related about the profitable enterprises and how the managers of those enterprises managed to use that for their personal benefit, which triggered a lot of public reaction. The resulting was the dispersed ownership, creation of a big number of small shareholders, and that had a number of consequences, starting with the efficiency of the operation of the companies, ability to attract foreign attention, and the negative public perception increasing, which was increasing. Now, a big lesson also, the second big lesson, and I think yes, is the sequencing and the fact that the privatization is only a part of a broader sequence or broader set of complementary reforms. It's only a part of the structural reform that are accompanied by legal, microeconomic, macroeconomic reforms. So the necessity of creating of a overall enabling market environment was extremely important. Property rights, they are trading, entry and exit into the market, and competition was extremely important. The other was a point that I wish to stress is that the privatization is a political process. It starts with the political decision, law is adopted, and then the process goes to the institution that is implementing it. So the critical is that the government also needs to commit in strong terms in curtailing its influence over the process once the legal decision is being made. and that it is essential that the process is being taken by a professional technical institution, empowered and safeguarded from the political influence. And the final point I want to make is the public support. It is not a popular process. It is potentially conflicts of interests happen, and there is a potential for politicization. So keeping the public on board, having a professionalization of the process, not politicized process, competent privatization institution, transparency of it to maintain the public support is extremely important. I'm sure that all of this very well are understood in Uzbekistan. Let me stop here. Etin Boringis, Uchun Katar Ahmad.
Thanks a lot, Matilda. Also very rich experience and points well taken. I think points that could be expanded on much further than just this session allows us. So some questions were coming in through the Q&A, interesting questions and comments that we will respond to live. And all that remains for me is to tell you all, thank you very much for participating in these sessions. We heard the importance of the legal framework, the rule of law in general, and to quote Ira, transparency, transparency, transparency. Akram, as for yourself, it's great to have a champion for privatization like yourself, and we're looking forward to supporting you further. Thanks a lot, Ira and Matilda, for your rich contributions. So friends and colleagues and your excellencies, until next time, this will for sure be continued. Thanks a lot for this session. Over to, I guess, directly Natalia, our conference moderator.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to this forum, and we really appreciate this opportunity to discuss these complex issues with you today. A lot has been said on the privatization and reducing and streamlining the state's role in the economy. We are now getting to the part where we will discuss the transformation of the largest enterprises that will remain in the government's ownership after the reforms are complete. That process goes in parallel with the privatization efforts of the government and is as important as the rest of the efforts. And today we have a very distinguished panel of speakers who will discuss this matter with us. We will start with His Excellency Minister of Finance, Timur Ishmetov, who leads the transformation of the state-owned banks and the largest 32 state-owned enterprises in Uzbekistan under the mandate of the Ministry of Finance. We also have with us today Hans Christiansen, who is the Deputy Head of Corporate Governance and Corporate Finance Division in OECD. OECD is the recognized authority on the corporate governance of the state-owned enterprises and is a custodian of the widely applied and referred OECD guidelines on corporate governance of state-owned enterprises. And we also have with us today Zsuzsanna Hargitay, who is the Managing Director for Central Asia of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So we will now start with His Excellency Minister Ishmetov. Please, over to you, Minister.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Today's topic is very important in our current stage of the overall economic reforms. I would probably briefly share with our experience on what kind of problems we face it while on this stage. Although, frankly speaking, we were kind of informed about such kind of problems at the beginning of our, should I say, of this process by the different IFIs, basically by the old IFIs. And I think it's maybe the common problem which many countries faces when they're going through this process, But somehow it seems to me that in our case, it's more complicated. It covers more and more areas. So first problem which we face is that now this stage of the reforms, probably the second one, the first one was more easy, if I can use this word, because it was supported by all the parties, I mean, by the population, by the business, and it was easy to implement. But this part of the reforms, it's now when we have different resistance, different understanding of the need of those reforms. So the first problem is that while we're trying to do transformation of the big SOE, state-owned companies, we now can see that it's the lack of the coordination of the sequencing of the reforms in certain companies with the reforms of those sectors where they operate. For example, if you look at in many of those, this financial to improve the financial condition of the companies means that we have to focus on the, let's say, tariff reforms on those sectors. And tariff reforms immediately brings us to the issue of to the social issue. And since it happens in many SOEs, what we understood, unfortunately, a bit later, that we should have focused on the social policy reforms from the day one. And now it's clear for us that the social policy reform, the proper social safety net, is the key for the success to continue all other next economic reforms. And this is the area where we are working within the last 1.5 years. Most of the IFIs who present here are supporting us in this area. The second problem is that sequencing reforms in those areas, I'm not talking about the companies, but now the sectors as well, and coordination with the other sectors. Let's say we currently working to improve transformation of chemical companies. For example, IFC is working with us. And now it's we see that to have a proper financial condition for those companies, we need actually the next step of the liberalization for the price of the fertilizers, and it's bring us to the reforms in the agriculture sector. So without doing one of the next step in the agriculture sector, it's difficult to work with the reforms in the chemical sector. Or the chemicals is related to the gas sector as well. So if we do reforms with the gas sector, it requires as a next step to look at the energy sector, electro-energy sector, which again brings us to the tariffs and etc. The third big problem is the modernization in most of the SOEs. Most of the equipment is very outdated, and in order to provide the proper transformation of those companies, we need to do some modernization, which is very, very costly. It is such a costly that the government cannot obviously afford it to, in short period of time, fulfill this investment demand, which was not done in the last quarter of the century. That's why we force those companies to look for the private money to attract resources, whether it's going to be loans, whether it's going to be, going to capital markets. But again, obviously, to be attractive for private investors, we need to provide the proper cash flow for the next 10 or 20 years for those companies. And it again brings us to reforms in the sectors where they operate. Again, with more liberalization, moving to the market prices. And it's again reforms which reflects the price. Another issue, it's kind of common, one of some of the participants already mentioned, is that there's some resistance from different parties. It's maybe not the resistance, I should rather use the word lack of coordination and understanding between with line ministries, those SOEs, with the management of SOEs. And it's understandable. There is some probably fear of quick changes. Maybe there is some fear for something new, or maybe in some cases some reluctance for those changes as well. So these four main problems which we are facing, and that's why, as many of colleagues, previous speakers mentioned, we are trying to use support of the international financial institutions who are focused on helping us with the reforms in different sectors of economy and advising us on not about the reforms itself, but about the proper sequencing and about the risk which we may arise if we do wrong sequencing of those reforms. At the same time, we understand, we now understood that we really need the support of the private, from the business side, from the consultants, because the capacity of providing these transformation processes is a big issue. And we understand that we cannot force the people something if they cannot do or if they do not want to do. That's why the issue of working with different private consultants, it's on our agenda, which we have already started. And the main issue is that we now have a big confidence that this is the right way, and we are eager to continue with our cooperations. But beside all those problems, I think there are already some results. So it's if we trying to focus on creating some benchmarks instead of trying to push some companies to do so. So let's say it's we really use our administrative resource to say to SOEs that you have to obtain international credit rating, and we have a timeline for all of them. For example, for this quarter, we have 2 SOEs. We have, hello? We have another kind of instrument to push them is to go into international capital markets. Although there are lots of complaints that we're kind of forcing companies to borrow again. But if they will not borrow, anyway, we have to provide financing for those modernization which they have to do, for kind of current operations. But if they go for capital markets, it's not just, you knock the door and you suddenly get the money from private investments from, I know, a couple of dozens of the countries. It's a huge process where you have to get those international credit ratings, where you have to move to international financial standards, etc., etc. You all know about it. And the good side of it is that we create a benchmark where we can show the price of the money. For example, one of the examples recently when we had one of the meetings in the government discussing to support one of the SOEs, they're a bit early to them to go for capital markets. There is a big investment program, and they asked for support, not necessarily from the budget, maybe from the banks. And the question was about the interest rate for those loans. And when usually they talk about certain interest rate, so namely they asked about, I don't think whether it was about 2 or 3%. And we said, look, UzAuto Motors recently went to capital markets and they raised money at 5%, something like that. 5%, 5%, 5%. less than 5%, 4.85. Why you think that you can borrow at less? Or the other example, when one of the SOEs gave an option that they found the financing from abroad in very good terms, and the good terms were talking about the 7 to 9%. And we're saying how you can say that it is a good option when you can see that UzAuto Motors borrowed at less than 5%. So it's a benchmark. If we try to talk about this price of borrowing previously, it's only referring to companies who is not in this country, and it's difficult to argue with them. But now it's much easier. The same when they, for example, asking financing from the budget, we say, okay, in local currency. Recently we issued Euro bonds, so government borrowed in the international capital markets in local currency sums. This is the first time, and the price was 14.5%. So investor priced our bonds, so they lent us at this price. So this is the price of money which we borrowed, which means this is the minimum you can ask from us at this price. So this is one of the examples when we are pushing them to work with the ratings, on work with the Euro bond. It's not about the rising money itself, but it's about to force them to implement several steps which otherwise it wouldn't be possible from the government side to push them to do it quickly. And the last one is that, which is we thought easy, but we at the beginning were a bit reluctant, but now we are more active, is that bringing people from abroad, specialists, firstly to the supervisory boards. There was some fear that we will have independent supervisory boards. What if we'll have majority them on the board? What if the head of the supervisory board will be from the independent members? But currently we see that it's more useful without any risks. In some banks, in many banks, we already have independent board members who are majority at the board, and they're very supportive. And as a next step, we are probably ready to go to bringing those independent experts to the executive board as well. And this is some simple ways, but it's already show some results. So probably I will pause here and give opportunity to other panelists to say. This is a more common but complicated and important problems which we are facing, but trying, and I think in most cases successful to solve those problems. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister Shmetov. Those are very important points that you touched on, and the reform coordination is one of them. It's hugely important to coordinate among various branches of the government to achieve the coordinated policy objectives. The task is indeed complex and ambitious. It requires diverse expertise, as you rightfully mentioned, and also measured approach. So the social implications are hugely important, and I'm glad that we heard about the social implications from so many speakers today. Also, the need to raise financing outside of the government circles is hugely important. And in addition to financing, access to financial markets also provides the necessary discipline to the companies that access those markets. And with that, I would like to turn to Mr. Hans Christiansen from OECD to give us an overview of his vision of the SOE reforms and his experience around the world on doing so. Hans, over to you.
Thank you very much, Natalia. Dear Minister, dear participants, it's a pleasure to be here today, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me. Yes, I wear many hats, but in essence, I am basically heading the OECD's work on state-owned enterprises, SOEs. And as several people, including Natalia, have already said, we are known in this area mostly for being the standard setter. I mean, the guidelines on corporate governance of state-owned enterprises that many of you will be familiar with, and if you're not, they're available in Russian, but not in Uzbek. Yes, they're a good practice, but I would like to just stress one other point about them, and that is that they're the world's only instrument in this area that is endorsed by multiple governments. I mean, 40 sovereign governments have formally associated themselves with these recommendations. And that's important for a second reason. And that is because these 40 governments then also meet for regular meetings in Paris to assess the implementation of the instrument and advise governments who wish to learn from reform experiences and sometimes receive practical advice from the OECD. You see, so it's not just a handful of smart guys in Paris, if I may say so, but it's really people who have it as a day job in various capitals to undertake the kind of reform that the Uzbek government is currently grappling with. So that's who we are and how we do it. Now, about the guidelines and in the context of your reform efforts, I'm not going to go through the instrument in detail. You can look at that yourself, but I would say that there are two fundamental visions in the OECD guidelines that we need to keep firmly before our eyes. The first is about transparency and disclosure. The second is about a proper vertical separation of responsibilities from the head of government and down to the corporate insiders. Now, first, about transparency. Of course, this is at the first level about proper financial and non-financial reporting from the SOEs themselves, according to internationally accepted best practices, IFRS or US GAAP in financial sectors and so what have we. Point two, importantly, it's also about the government engaging in what we call aggregate reporting to Parliament and to the general public on a regular basis, not just by stapling together company reports, but really taking ownership of a report so that the public and the press and the parliamentarians can see an overview over what enterprises are the taxpayers on the hook for and how have they been performing. Okay, that was point one. Point two, about the vertical separation of responsibilities. I mean, the OECD model implies that these enterprises are not the plaything of individual ministers or government institutions. They are owned by the state on behalf of the population. And certain decisions need to be taken by the government acting as one body. And that's developing a rationale for state ownership. It came up in the privatization discussion, but I mean, it needs to be absolutely clear why and under what circumstances the state would own commercial enterprises. And behind this, you can then derive a privatization list, because if those rationales are no longer present, then you should really consider selling. But that's point one. But then point two, issuing what we call a state ownership policy, which is really a concise document explaining to all and everybody how the government exercises its rights as owners of enterprises. Then that's the whole of government. But then the government will normally delegate the responsibility of overseeing the SOEs to a specialized body, a ministry or whatever. We recommend that you establish a centralized government ownership agency so that you have the ownership in one place. There are a couple of reasons for that. Point one is that it makes it much easier to separate the government's role as owners and regulators, policymakers, lawmakers, because if the people who are responsible for the operational performance of those enterprises are also those who set sectoral regulation, then we really have a problem. Or if that's not possible, then we say, okay, it's a second best, where they at least establish what we call a coordination agency to make sure that okay, maybe some SOEs lie with different government institutions, but at least the whole of government accepts ownership and conducts oversight over these processes. Actually, I was intrigued when I read about Uzbekistan that you have basically established yourself with two SOE portfolios, one with SAMA and the other with the Ministry of Finance. And I was racking my brain to see if I could find another national example of this being done. There is one in the OECD area, and that's Turkey, with the Ministry of Finance and the Privatization Administration. The Privatization Administration has a lot of companies that are not likely to be privatized anytime soon, but which are largely commercial. But okay, fine, it's not our main recommendation, but it's definitely better than having these enterprises lying across how many ministries. Then point 3, that's then about this ownership entity, as we call it, whoever it is, making absolutely clear what the enterprises in its portfolio are expected to achieve in financial and in non-financial terms. There's absolutely nothing odious about SOEs having to do things that a private company would not do. I mean, presumably that's why the state owns them in the first place. But there needs to be transparency about what these things are and how it's to be financed. And that crucial guidance and information must come from the ownership entity and be communicated to, point 4, to the boards of directors of these state-owned enterprises, who then develop strategies, or perhaps more realistically, approve strategies that give the SOE a reasonable shot at implementing the owner's expectations. This is a crucially important point because in our experience, and perhaps especially in post-transition economies, but also in other parts of the world, is really that the boards of directors are significantly too weak. And that creates a situation where executive managers in the SOEs talk directly to the ownership ministers, and there's no proper oversight. But a strong, independent, and professional board of directors is really the guarantee of an autonomous state-owned enterprise. And this is why, and I'm bringing this up in the Uzbek context, because the working party in the OECD that deals with this issue, we have again and again come up with the recommendation that please get ministers off the boards of these enterprises. The board is supposed to be capable, as we say, of independent and autonomous judgment. I'm sorry, but the minister cannot be independent from himself or herself. So, but this is not me talking to you. It's what the OECD Working Party has said on numerous occasions. So then, in the context of reform specifically, because here the Working Party has been working with numerous countries who seek OECD reviews and reform recommendations in various phases of SOE reform. And of course, if you read the SOE guidelines, you're going to probably get depressed and say, how can we possibly do all that? I mean, nobody has really fully implemented this instrument. It's an absolute best practice about what countries would do if only they could. So, but that's useful because they continue to serve as a roadmap for further reform, even for the most advanced countries in this world. But if you're not the most advanced country in this world, then of course it raises a couple of issues about priorities and about sequencing of reform. I mean, what do you need to do as a matter of priority? And checking priorities first, I mean, I was actually surprised when I read about your very ambitious reform agenda in Uzbekistan, and we're talking about a portfolio of more than 2,000 SOEs. And I thought, how on earth can they manage this? Because, you know, in best practice countries, let's take one, Sweden, which is one of the very popular countries with our working party. They have one so-called investment manager responsible for each 2 SOEs, or 3 if they're small. And they follow these companies on a daily basis and participate in kind of the board of directors and so forth. And so you see, by sheer numbers, since they are not the only people in the ownership unit, it means that they have almost a member of staff in that ownership entity per SOE in their portfolio. And the only country with large SOEs portfolios that I've seen getting close to that is China. And if that is not feasible in Uzbekistan, which I think it is not, then you may want to focus on 15, 20, 25 priority SOEs that are either particularly large or particularly commercial and out there to start with. That would be based on past OECD experience. And then finally, because I'm probably also running out of time here, but finally, about reform sequencing. And here I can definitely say, when we had discussed this with the post-transition economists, there are 3 top reform priorities that always tend to come up. And I mean, and some of them you have touched upon in your reform process. I'm not saying that you start from a clean sheet, but the 3 things that always come up is point 1, make sure that you really clarify who exercises ownership rights and put in place mechanisms to ensure that they do so on a whole of government basis. And that's usually done through the state ownership law, which I understand is being developed in your country. Point 2, make sure that you get clear objectives, financial, non-financial, and otherwise, laid down and established formally for each SOE, because otherwise there can be no accountability. Unless it's clear what is to be done, it cannot be measured, it cannot be evaluated. Point 3, put in place these mechanisms for aggregate reporting. It may seem like an afterthought, but it's not, because it's one of the most potent tools to drive continued reform. Is once the parliamentarians and the press and the public can actually see what they are on the hook for financially, it creates a considerable impetus to continued reform. And then perhaps I add one last 4th point, and that is about boards of directors. It's perhaps not in terms of priority the highest priority, but if you the most urgent priority, but if you need to put in place good professional boards of directors in many SOEs, it takes a heck of a long time. So there is an argument for starting sooner rather than later. And I congratulate Uzbekistan with your progress in getting a number of independent board members, and it has been a problem in a number of post-transition economies. We discussed it with Bulgaria, and they were afraid that private business people would look after their interest rather than the company interest if they were allowed to join the board. And we have talked to the Ukrainians recently, and they were afraid that foreign board members might make the company unaccountable to Ukrainian politicians. So there's a lot of challenges here, and we are heartened to see that the Uzbek authorities are committed to address them. So I stop here. Thank you, Natalia.
Thank you very much, Hans. That was very informative, and we're glad to see that Uzbekistan is on the way on implementing or planning to implement most of the points that you just touched upon. And not to take any time from Zuzana, I want to hand over to you, Zuzana, because EBRD has been very instrumental in supporting the government in these efforts. If I can only ask you to try to keep it in under 10 minutes so we can pass on to the panel, that would be much appreciated. Over to you.
Natalia, no problem at all. I'm a very fast speaker. A very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, your excellencies, assalamu alaikum. I'm a newcomer to Central Asia. I have been in this position for the last 10 days. You see on the screen my good colleague Alkis Drakinos, a longtime friend of Uzbekistan, who is there and has been working in this country. But I come from also, like Andrea and Matilda, I also come from a transition country, Hungary. And I also directly come from Serbia, where the government has just adopted the state ownership policy, where the privatization of the last large state-owned bank has finally happened. I hasten to add that our pre-privatization equity, just between us, conference participants, and myself, we made in 2006. It took some time to nudge further the privatization of this bank. So by EBRD, as Natalia, you said, we have been very active in the transformation of SOEs and promoting privatization, at least since 2018, when we signed an MOU with the government of Uzbekistan. We were there to help with the preparation of the strategy for governance and reform of SOEs, now adopted by the government. We also worked with UzSAMA on the new law on state property management, and also provided support to them in drafting the new privatization law. And it's not just written comments. We are talking about a very interactive process. We have also provided a detailed implementation plan for the strategy. And we were very glad last week to see this draft largely reflected in the implementation plan of SOMA proper. But EBRD, I hope, is also famous for getting our hands dirty and go down to company level. So my colleagues have been already working on preparing bank privatization. We were working with the teams. Deputy Prime Minister Kuchkarov already mentioned Asaka Bank. Well, this is eminently an area where EBRD has had experience only for the last 30 years now. I see here our former president, Suma, has appeared on the screen, who would be nodding at this. So we would be there, and we are also ready to be there to consider putting in our equity. We are active participants in the power sector, and as we are financing investments, so we can help draft corporate governance action plans. Hans Christiansen mentioned already the OECD Bible. I could put it that way, that we have also actively been using when drafting corporate governance action plans. And needless to say that in this sector as well, as Minister Ishmetov mentioned, well, transformation of SOEs in the power sector eminently needs to be coupled with wider reforms, whether it's tariff methodology, whether it's regulatory framework. And also, I would look forward to discussing with our Uzbek counterparts what could be EBRD's role potentially in the mining sector, improving corporate governance, strategic planning, working on legislative framework for mining, and perhaps even pre-privatization assistance. Sharing a couple of points from EBRD expertise and also my personal. Somebody mentioned that let us not politicize this process. SOE transformation, I beg to disagree, and privatization is a deeply political process. This is one of those shocking processes, so it's unavoidable that it's political. And the process is difficult, the road is very bumpy, and the results will come probably in lumps. So therefore, it's necessary to build and rebuild political consensus on the objectives and steps among stakeholders. And as one of the speakers mentioned, it is very important that our Uzbek friends also have adequate attention paid to and budget to communicate effectively with the society. Because we need to explain, apologies if I use very rude words, but in Hungary and other countries I worked in, privatization was equal to theft, selling the family silver, selling below value. So constantly to communicate why we are doing it, communicate the successes. There will be successes, and they need to be highlighted, whether it's improving financial services, whether it's creating new jobs. Number two, a lot of speakers mentioned already proper sequencing, and they mentioned, and I think rightly so, bank privatization, small-scale privatization, and also corporate restructuring of public utilities. While the implementation plan will be adjusted based also on the results, let's stick to most of it. So again, let us not come in waves, because enthusiasm will also flag. Now, SOE transformation, a lot of speakers mentioned that it will have its social consequences, but I think one of the speakers mentioned an important point, that setting up supervisory board with new members, holding management accountable for performance, separating policy making from actually running SOEs, setting up regulators. It will also hit current managers, current policymakers. It's a very deeply personal kind of change as well for this level as well. And this, I put it in my speaking notes, let me change it to will, put hurdles to progress. So let us think together of how to train people, provide, again, EBRD has been also doing supervisory board training, managerial trainings. Let's think how best to select champions to hold. Yes, there should be also severance packages, even for senior managers that have worked well, but they will not be able to be there for the change. Yes, I'm a senior manager, Alku, so probably if I don't perform, I'm also deserving a nice goodbye. One thing that, again, speaker mentioned is selling below real value. Now, technical financial valuation is an important first step. Typically, we start, as we did 30 years ago, at pretty high valuation. We believe that transactions, and I'm talking about transactions and not valuation, they should be put to a market test. Ultimately, we are talking about, when it comes to privatization, about a transaction between a willing or sometimes unwilling seller, and there has to be a willing buyer. And then assumptions for valuations will need to be adjusted. So it is going to be an iterative process. One issue that I don't think that many speakers have touched upon is about land, and land in three respects. Number one, Alkis, I will ask you, colleagues in Uzbekistan and partners, I will ask you how up to date the land registry is when it comes to land ownership. It has been crucial across all where I have worked, where Bjerde has worked in Central Southeastern Europe, that at least we know which lands we own and whether it's up to date. Number two, there needs to be a decision, and there must be an ongoing discussion in Uzbekistan about agricultural land, which is the land that we do not necessarily want to sell, but give to long-term lease. Do we want to sell it now when the value is low? Similar discussion is still ongoing, you will not believe it, within the European Union. Land typically has best gone together with companies that owned it, that are required for performing those functions. There was one question in the chat group. Yes, the governments could opt also for long-term lease of the land underlying under the assets, but they typically are sold together with the companies. And two more things, if I could mention it. One is, as we have helped with drafting the capital markets law, we will be there also for Uzbekistan to help work on building up the capital markets. Some of the speakers emphasize, I will join them, the importance of dynamically building up capital markets, whether for bonds or stock trading. And yes, I would like to see also functioning IPOs and preparing companies for IPOs in Uzbekistan. Last but not least, as I mentioned now twice, bank privatization. State-owned banks have been typically used to provide also subsidized lending to companies. So as banks will turn commercial, they will be working on a commercial basis to the benefit of shareholders, to the benefit of and securing the deposits and making good sound decisions. So the governments would need to think about what to use to provide targeted subsidies, credit support, credit guarantee support, different schemes, again, targeted, not for all companies, because they would need to be built up. These institutions are part and parcel, even of developed economies. There is a lot of experience here, and we are dumping it on our Uzbek partners many times. It is for them, it is for their country. They will need to select, and we are one of those who are committed, of course, to work together with our partners in World Bank, ADB, OECD. Apologies if I have missed out some of them, so that you get the best advice and that is suitable for your economy. And I very much look forward to our visit to Uzbekistan. Natalia, we are preparing a visit. It will be led by our first vice president. So we will continue our discussion the week of the 7th of June. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Zuzana. And I just want to echo your words that all of the partners are standing by the Uzbek government, and we are providing this support to all partners in Uzbekistan, in private sector and in public sector, to support the transformation of your economy. The governance reforms of the SOEs are complex and require a lot of coordination, but we also want to emphasize that they take time. They take time to materialize and demonstrate the results. So we just want you to be patient and to stay on the right course and be transparent, as mentioned many times, but also open with the public. So communication campaign is one of the most important aspects of this reform. And with that, I would like to thank all of the panelists, Minister Ishmetov, Hans, Zuzana, thank you so much. And I'm handing back to Esfandyar. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia. I think that probably what we should do is hand out a PhD to everyone who has attended this event in privatization, because we've learned so much. But we're in our final discussion, and I'm committing to you that we're going to run it short and sharp because I know everyone wants to take some time to have conversations on today's proceedings outside. We'll start with Sarsuma Chakrabarti, who's currently an advisor to the president of Uzbekistan and is familiar to many of us in this room as the former president of EBRD. Sarsuma, a question for you. Some people may not know that before becoming the president of EBRD, you were a senior civil servant. And so the question we have is from a public administration standpoint, given how significant the implementation challenges are in a program of policy like this, what are the priorities for Uzbekistan to get administration right and then to get the implementation of the policy right?
Well, thank you very much, Yaron. It's a pleasure to be able to join you from my house in Oxford, UK. I wish I was with you in Tashkent, but I will be very soon, I hope, in late June. And it's a pleasure, I should say, also to follow my former colleague, Zhuzha, who let me congratulate very publicly on her promotion to Managing Director for the Central Asia region. I tried to persuade her to go for this job a couple of years ago and failed miserably. I'm glad she's now in this role and look forward to working with her and with all of you as well in the MDBs, but also with all of my Uzbek friends as well. Well, let me say, I mean, I think, you know, a lot has been said already about what needs to happen in terms of the process to make privatization successful. But I think a crucial point that Zhuzha, I think, made is it's partly a political process, a highly political process, but it's partly also about getting the process of actual change and reform right in order to make privatization successful. I mean, we know the arguments for why Uzbekistan needs to move on this and actually needs to gather momentum on the privatization journey. I think there are more than 2,500 enterprises still with state involvement. That's a huge number, a huge number, actually. And it is a stranglehold, in my view, on economic life and development of the market economy. And the government has understood this. Minister Ishmetov was very clear just a few minutes ago, the need to reduce state participation in the economy. And the government has a firm commitment with the 21 to 25 privatization strategy. And it's reinforced that commitment with subsequent decrees as well. And I think that shows that the government is trying really hard to conduct privatization in the right way. It's a highly visible process in which international commentators, investors, analysts, they place great importance when they actually try to gauge the country's commitment to economic reforms. It's at the heart of that judgment. Is this country really moving towards a market-based economy or not? And the number of privatizations completed, the process that's been followed, and the economic outcomes will all be closely scrutinized. And therefore it goes to the heart of Uzbekistan's future reputation as well. And it's critical to ensure that those judgments come out right. And that means following a good, well-justified and transparent process, as Ira Lieberman, I think, also said earlier. Now, there are many challenges ahead, but I would say the ones that I would highlight in brief are, first of all, the difficulties with evaluation methodology that frankly is resulting in artificially high minimum prices. This is absolutely typical, but you know, these prices are higher than really the market would say that these institutions are worth. And by having such artificially high minimum prices, all we're doing is discouraging potential investors at the outset. The second, I think, which is linked, is a lack of realism, I would say, about the revenues to be raised from privatizations, given that a number of these enterprises, frankly, and banks as well, are in not very good shape. They're still, nevertheless, even if the financial value is not going to be very high, there remains substantial economic value, which is different from financial value, to be produced by privatizing these assets. A third challenge, I think, that we have to look at is the lack of a framework to decide which assets should be sold quickly, allowing new owners to transform them, versus which assets will need to be restructured ahead of sale. On this point, I think it should be noted that the recent presidential and cabinet of ministers decrees did identify a number of assets that should be sold quickly, and I think that's a positive step. It gives an impetus to the process. And for those major state enterprises and banks that are under transformation, I think there's a huge need now to put in place independent corporate governance and management at arm's length from government officials. There's evidence from so many countries which shows that supervisory boards that are filled with government appointees who don't have the appropriate experience or the capacity or the time to oversee an enterprise properly. And this simply leads to further destruction of value, actually. And I think that one of the key things that others have mentioned, I would also emphasize, is get that corporate governance right immediately, as fast as you can. And finally, I think a challenge, and I hope Minister Ishmetov and Sama will back me on this, the need for sufficient resources in the ministry and in Sama on transformation and privatization. It's a huge task being faced by the ministry and by Sama. And on this point, I did notice that in February, the presidential decree reorganized and increased the number of employees in Sama. We just need to make sure the resourcing of this agency is absolutely right going forward. Otherwise, it will struggle to bring off this huge agenda. Now, these challenges, of course, can also be solved by adopting a proper ownership policy, which defines how the states decide which assets should stay in public ownership and which of them need to be privatized. And I think Sama should also be granted now proper independence and better empowered as an executor of state assets and of the privatization program. And we also need a new privatization law, which should be adopted to introduce transparency in the privatization process and a new modern valuation methodology. Of course, the preparation of the draft legislation, as Zhuja highlighted, needs to be done, I think, in cooperation with international institutions like the EBRD, the IFC. They have a lot of experience in this area, and Uzbekistan would do well to use that experience. Final point, we all know privatization is a complex process. The actual decision to privatize an asset needs to consider all sorts of issues, including the issues related to natural monopolies and the overall policy orientation of privatization and PPPs. So it's critically important, of course, to ensure that privatization doesn't simply transfer monopoly privileges into private hands. A competition policy is absolutely adjacent as well, should be adjacent to the privatization push. And the government of Uzbekistan, I also think, would be well advised, as I have advised in my own reports, to ensure that all future sales or privatizations of major or strategic assets are actually validated by an independent committee of non-regional foreign experts. This will only help Uzbekistan's reputation in a process that's political, in a process where emotions are charged, where people will make all sorts of allegations. So having that independent validation by an expert group would, I think, really help Uzbekistan in this process too. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sir Suma, and I'm aware that you have another important meeting, so please do feel free to drop off, and thank you for your time today. One of the things that Sir Suma mentioned was finding the right balance and the right kind of golden mean when it comes to valuations. But another issue that was talked about today, and Mr. Akram Mukhatmakulov mentioned it, gave us an analogy that privatization is like driving a bus. The question is, how fast should the bus go? We've heard that it's important that we generate momentum for this program, but we also know that in the experience of other countries, going too fast has led to suboptimal outcomes. We're fortunate to have Mr. Nasruddin Khojayev, the first Deputy Minister at the Ministry of Finance, with us today. And if I may, Deputy Minister, in just a few minutes, I would be interested to have your thoughts on how exactly the government intends to get the speed of privatization right. The roadmap calls for a milestone by 2025. How do we balance speed and being fast and being fastidious?
Yes, hello, good afternoon. Well, this is probably one of the most important questions that we keep asking ourselves. So what about, about the right speed for the privatization? Well, Ministry of Finance is focusing on those 32 companies that are that we are being proud shareholder of, as well as banks that also are in our transformation mandate. As far as banks are concerned, yes, it's pretty clear and was made public about our plans, and we're moving fast with our plans. The biggest banks would be privatized from 2021 to 2024, and some of them are in the process of privatization already. But overall, we are, being very prudent and very calculated in terms of our privatization programs, both regarding both banks and SOEs. Yes, we are working on, I would say, a couple of, let me call it demonstration cases whereby we can first test those waters of privatization and test our capacity to efficiently navigate through those waters of privatization. So far, experience has been mostly successful. However, we do understand that capacity is not available to the extent it should be available for the larger scale privatization. Very important point that Mr. Ishmetov has been making earlier is that privatization of SOEs is a political process very much linked and dependent on the progress in other areas. So we do have to implement rather painful reforms in a number of sectors before we can proceed with a larger scale privatization of larger SOEs. So it includes tariff reform, it includes structural reforms in a number of areas, oil and gas, electricity, transportation. And what is important there is find the right balance. I'd like to join a point Suma was earlier making about which assets to sell. This is still a process which, this is still a question that we have to elaborate our answer to. So right now what we are moving on, what we are focusing on is optimizing whatever assets we have, working on improving their performance, making them more transparent by improving their governance, by bringing independent directors. This has started with banks a couple of years back. It has been mostly successful. There are a few drawbacks. We're well aware of them. We're working on them, but mostly we believe that banks have changed. So despite all the criticism, we realize that banking system has mostly changed into somewhat more market-like than previous state-owned banks. We all know that there are predominantly independent boards with a few larger banks. We are working on a large scale privatization of one of the state-owned banks. So we are planning to scale this up to SOEs as well. It has started, the process has started. We will be bringing independent board members to most of those 32 SOEs within the Ministry of Finance. So, I mean, where Ministry of Finance is being a shareholder. We are running optimization programs at all of them. But what is to come, what is still to come is right restructuring of industries those companies operate. So answering your question, when do I think, and when does Ministry of Finance thinks when larger scale privatization can take place? I mean, privatization of larger SOEs can take place. I believe it's a medium-term perspective, but provided the reforms in other sectors are well coordinated into this process. So we still have to design. We do hope that with help of our partners from international financial organizations, this coordinated effort which can ultimately lead to the successful privatization. I hope I've answered your question.
Thank you very much. I think we're now going to hear from two individuals representing two of the IFIs. This is obviously a World Bank co-hosted event, but we've been fortunate to hear from individuals from EBRD, and now we have Mr. Enrico Pinali of ADB and Mr. Ron van Roden of IMF. And I think the question for them is, their presence here indicates that there's a collaborative approach being taken to supporting the process of privatization that First Deputy Minister Nasruddin Khojayev just discussed. So very briefly, and forgive me for being rude, Ron and Enrico, but if I can just ask you to comment a little bit on what does this collaborative approach signal for financial and strategic investors? Should it give them more confidence that these IFIs are working hand in hand to drive this process forward?
Thanks, Asfander, for giving us the opportunity to bring the perspective of other IFIs. And it's likewise a pleasure to be here today. I guess with regards to your question, I can say, first of all, I agree with what First Deputy Minister Nasruddin Khojayev just said. This is really a concerted effort among us, IFIs, of course, but the government and other stakeholders. Just to give you some example, we have set up coordination group for sector reform. We are partnering on some of these key transformation endeavors, especially in the financial sector where we have a constant dialogue. And these are all good signs, especially when it comes down to attracting investors. Now, I think what is really guiding us, what are the principles? These are the best practice principles that, we have been mentioning the whole day: the introduction of fiscal reforms to ensure fiscal sustainability, the improvement of corporate governance in SOEs, in general, overall improvement of standards, financial reporting in particular. These are key elements to make operations of the SOE financially viable. And these are all ingredients that I think we all agree in today's discussion. I believe that everybody pretty much touched upon these elements. And these are the key elements to make the SOEs more attractive when time comes for enticing investors. And these are the guiding principles that are characterizing all of our activities. I don't want to go into too many details of what ADB is doing, but of course, we're working with SAMA on improving these corporate governance rules for SOEs, establishing methodology, establishing performance evaluation for SOEs, and we working like other IFIs and with other IFIs on diagnostics and implementation of transformation plans for SOEs. And this will give confidence to the investors that all the SOEs have undergone this process of reviews and transformation. One thing that I'm really keen personally is the fact that we are working on this IFRS implementation and adoptions. And this is very useful for any type of investor, in particular, as Minister Ishmetov said before, we have seen that the adoption of internationally recognized accounting standards, it's a key ingredient for transparency. And we saw it how the SOEs and SOBs, especially the banks, have tapped into the international Eurobond market, as was previously said. So this is a sign of transparency, and this is something that we're all working together by having this IFRS international standards, providing that sense of comfort for the investors to come into the country, invest in these SOEs. So, I think to finalize, because I understand we're short on time, continuing with this improvement of standards by all of us IFIs and corporate governance, financial accounting, other measures that bring accountability and efficiency is really the way forward. So bear in mind, we're still in COVID times, hence the expectation on the results of the SOE reforms in terms of privatization must be weighted with the current economic reality. Nevertheless, I think we're on the right track, and I encourage the government to continue on this path forward.
Thank you, Enrico. Ron, Enrico pointed to this kind of broad agreement about the kinds of reforms that are necessary, and I'm sure that the IMF likewise is happy that things like IFRS are being taken forward. Your thoughts on this collaborative approach and the role of your fund, briefly, please.
No, I mean, thanks very much. And thanks for allowing me to participate in a very, very interesting discussion. And a lot of ground has been covered already this afternoon, this morning for others. But it's good to take a little bit of a step back and say, why are we doing this? And why are we proceeding with state-owned enterprise reform and privatization? And as we see that Uzbekistan, like other countries, hopefully is coming out of the pandemic. But what Uzbekistan needs is stronger, sustainable, and more inclusive economic growth, and especially private sector growth. I think Anna mentioned it also this morning. There's a need to provide more jobs for a fairly rapidly growing population, a rapidly growing workforce. And these jobs will need to come mainly from the private sector, mainly from small and medium-sized enterprises. I mean, that is the experience that we have seen in other countries in transition. Now, the role of the government in all of this is to provide an enabling framework by creating an environment that is conducive to private sector development, that provides macroeconomic stability, with sound monetary and fiscal policies. And this is where the IMF also in coordination with the other IFIs clearly comes in. But it also means indeed what had been mentioned earlier this morning is to reduce the still very large role of the state in the economy. And that is why we are talking about state-owned enterprise reform of the state-owned banks as well, not just the state-owned enterprises. And moving forward with privatization. And in that sense, I mean, we're also very pleased to see that there is a clear commitment from the authorities, from the government to proceed with this. And things are clearly on the right track. And a lot of issues are being thought about, are covered. But what we think is needed right now, and even while we recognize that this is a difficult environment with a lot of countries, I mean, still in the pandemic, coming out of the pandemic, but to actually make a start with privatization and to have a couple of success cases, hopefully still this year. And I think that had also been mentioned by the finance minister and the deputy prime minister earlier today. To have a couple of successful cases of privatizing a few state-owned enterprises, a few state-owned banks. And as Suma was saying, I mean, there is a very large universe of state-owned enterprises, about 2,000 or even more of that. Many of them maybe won't be worth all that much, but I mean, again, starting with I mean, maybe not with the largest, but with a couple of mid-sized enterprises and state-owned banks, to demonstrate a commitment, to demonstrate that the authorities can do this, is what has been emphasized by many also today, to do this in a transparent and open manner. I mean, that is of critical importance. And I agree also what Suma was saying earlier, in having the political will, having the political commitment, because it is not an easy process, including because of the social aspects, I mean, that are involved and everything else. And for example, what Suma was referring to, a practical issue of can you sell a company for less than what has been the book value? In many countries, we have seen from experience that it can prove to be very difficult to sell a company below some value that appears on the books of a company, but that actually has little reflection of what the economic value of that company is. And to break that, and sometimes, I mean, we haven't even seen that has consequences for the willingness of people to pursue that, because they are afraid that they may be prosecuted or face accusations of corruption. So again, that political will, that political support for the process is very important. Let me say one more thing. I mean, because at the IMF we look at it mainly from a macroeconomic perspective. I mean, if we look at the financing of Uzbekistan as the country as a whole, from the perspective of the balance of payments, I mean, right now we see that the country has a large current account deficit, and a current account deficit that is mainly financed by the accumulation of more debt, both by state-owned enterprises, both by the government, and both by state-owned banks, and much less than we would like to see by actual investment. And so continuing with the reforms, including the privatization and the reform and restructuring of state-owned enterprises, and making Uzbekistan more attractive for investment, both domestic but also foreign. I mean, to change that financing of the balance of payments is of critical importance. And again, I mean, with the ultimate goal to achieve stronger, sustainable and inclusive economic growth and provide more jobs for the population. So let me stop there.
Thank you, Ron. An excellent contribution. One of the the team members in the collaborative effort is IFC, and we have Mr. Zafar Khashimov with us here today. And I wanted to turn to him with a question
I'm
about...
sorry, if you don't mind, I'm sorry.
Please.
Zafar, we just had a brief conversation. Well, Suma and Ron, they both, they touched upon an important subject, which is valuation. Indeed, it's a challenging matter, as Uzbek legislation actually requires any asset which is being privatized, a state asset which is being privatized, to be privatized at the valuation, at the specific valuation. And it has been, source of a lot of controversy in the past, and we've realized it's being a problem. So in a recent privatization project that SAMA is pursuing, you might notice that those mandatory valuation is being treated differently. So SAMA has managed to change its approach. So now it's an indicative valuation. So they plan to privatize at a valuation which is a market valuation, rather than something which is by nature being overinflated due to some regulatory purposes. So this SAMA has managed to get more flexibility on this valuation matter, and I believe it will be very helpful with other projects going forward. It will be addressed in the legislation, but approach is changing. So I just wanted to give you this quick feedback, if you don't mind.
Excellent. Thank you for the interjection. Mr. Khashimov, a question for you. The IFC, one of the main things that it has been working on is bond issuances abroad and supporting that process. I'm curious to know from you, how do you see that process of gaining credibility with foreign investors, proving the creditworthiness of Uzbek securities as supporting privatization?
Thank you very much. Let me a little bit clarify. So far, we are focusing on issuing IFC bonds in international bank markets, and it is more about increasing interest and gaining interest of the investors to Uzbekistan as a country. Because yes, they know IFC, and actually we've been the first international institution who issued Uzbekistan currency denominated bonds in London Stock Exchange. And yes, and because of wide-scale reforms which are going on in Uzbekistan, we've been second, because of currency reforms which happened early in 2017, we've been managed to issue our bonds, and we've managed to issue them very successfully. Currently, what we are working on in very close collaboration with Ministry of Finance and Central Bank, we are now trying to issue onshore bonds, IFC bonds in Uzbekistan, denominated in local currency. And I believe it would be one more very important step in capital market development of the country, where the first AAA emittent would come up to the market with bonds in local currency. And I believe it is possible, it became possible just because of reforms which are going on in the country. And it shows a huge interest of potential investors to our local currency papers in Uzbekistan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Khashimov. One of the countries, the comparisons that we've heard today is comparing Uzbekistan to Poland. And it's a particularly apt comparison because if I have my numbers correct, the population of Uzbekistan today and the GDP per capita are similar to where Poland was in 1990, which shows the potential. We have with us Mr. Wisla Kashmarek, who's an advisor to UzSAMA. And I wanted to ask you a very short, sharp question. What is the one way that the comparison can be made to Poland? What is the most similar thing about Uzbekistan and Poland as two cases? And what is the one greatest difference? And how can that illuminate our understanding?
Большое спасибо за вопрос. Прежде всего, добрый вечер. Ну да, у меня есть немного опыта, потому что я в Польше был почти 6 лет министром приватизации. И не только знаю, как это делать, а тоже почти после 25 лет могу сказать, что мы сделали и какие есть результаты. Разница, да? Но главная разница. Но я могу сказать так. Мои очень болезненные столкновения с Узбекистаном – это была встреча с юридической системой, правовой системой этой страны. Потому что для человека с другого системы, с другой культуры, мы привыкли до этого, что есть конституция и законы. Из этого все вытекает для правительства и для других. В Узбекистане есть 3 источники права. Президент, правительство и парламент. Для каждого инвестора, который оценивает или возможно инвестировать и какие риски в данной стране, оценка юридического риска, прозрачности этой системы – это очень важное. И мне кажется, что это этих разниц много, потому что мы, жалко так сказать, но с разных культур, ну так можно сказать. Была вторая разница, которая для меня очень была важная, а в Польше, когда мы делали трансформацию, это не было так, что первые законы, это были законы по приватизации, по рынку капитала, по налогам. Первый закон, который начал приватизацию и трансформацию в Польше, это был закон о территориальном самоуправлении. Он дал тоже результаты до этого, что с 8500 предприятий, которые были с начала 2019 года, почти 2000 предприятий, ГУПов, мы передали, можно сказать, властям на местах, это значит территориальному самоуправлению, потому что результатом этого закона, этой реформы было, что уже в Польше есть 2 столба публичной власти – правительство и самоуправление. Это значит, что президента Варшавы, например, выбираем в прямых выборах. Что похоже? Похоже, я хотел бы, чтобы в Узбекистане было так, что был такой, это может быть такой энтузиазм для изменений делания всех реформ, которые перед вами. Похоже, это тоже так, что я когда приехал, год тому приехал в Узбекистан, я чувствовал, и это может быть нехорошее замечание, я чувствовал в Узбекистане так, как в половине 90-х в Польше. Але что это значит? Это значит то, что все, что мы сделали в Польше, можно сделать тоже в Узбекистане. Я был бы очень рад поспориться с некоторыми утверждениями в этом панеле, может будет какая-то способность, может будет какая-то способность передать разные идеи и замечания. Но только одна вещь. Советник президента сказал, что проблема в Узбекистане – это проблема количества предприятий. Нет. В Узбекистане проблема – это качество этих предприятий. В Польше было 8500, и можно было это продать, и доверяйте, 1/3 мы ликвидировали по качеству, по экономическому состоянию, по не хватало рынка, не хватало новых технологий. И чтобы то окончить, вокруг меня сидят двое друзей, Азиз и Акрам, они работают в такой компании, которая называется UzSAMA. Это одна из, можно сказать, один из инструментов приватизации. И они получили задачу продать всем нам, я думаю, что вы все знаете, Ферганский нефтеперерабатывающий завод. Я только вам покажу два фактора. Во всем в мире не строится уже в нефтечасти заводов емкости менее чем 6 миллионов тонн нефти. Я вижу, уже кончу. Этот завод построен на 4,5 миллиона по проекту, по использованию 2 миллиона тонн. Самая старшая часть, я не научился еще этого названия, Арирауавык, или что-то, Аутарык, это самая старшая инсталляция оборудования нефтепереработки, по-моему, в мире. 19 построена в 1996 году. И уже кончу. Для сравнения. Ферганская – это ваш ключевой элемент опасности энергетичной государства. Это надо о этом помнить. Это не так, что придет какой-то UzSAMA или другая АУГа и будет продавать эту компанию без никаких обязанностей в будущем. 4,5 проектная емкость переработки, уровень занятости 6500. В Польше есть такая компания, похожая по продуктам, называется Płock, рафинерия. 16 миллионов тонн переработки, емкость, занятость 5000 сотрудников. Это не идет в том, что есть 3, 4, 5, 6 компаний. Проблема в том, что есть проблем с качеством этой и состоянием. Или государство может помочь, в этом случае может помочь. Первая задача – это слабость этой компании, что, например, это речь о трансформации. Слабость этой компании, что нет поставок собственного сырья. Это должен быть результат международных договоров между Узбекистаном и окружающими странами, чтобы сделать возможность таких поставок.
If I may ask you just to conclude, please, for the sake of time. Thank you.
Спасибо.
Thank you very much. Well, we know now that the PhD we will all receive, now that we've talked about the Poland case in depth, is in comparative political economy. So this is a case that we should be looking at more closely. We are approaching the end of the program. I want to thank everyone for their patience. And before I forget, allow me to thank the translators for their phenomenal feat in translating a very technical discussion for 3 hours. So a big thank you to them. We're going to hear now from Vinny Nagaraj, a senior economist at the World Bank, who is sitting to my left. Vinny will help crystallize. We'll then turn to Lilia Boruchuk, who is joining us virtually. And then I will turn it back to Director Ortikov to close the event. But Vinny, your thoughts, and also a question that was given to us by a journalist from UzReport, about the role of youth. We're obviously doing a privatization for future generations. Youth have a role to play as well. Maybe you can comment on that.
Thanks. Salam alaikum, Hurmatli Honimlar, Janublar. It's really good to be here tonight. This has been a long time in the making to bring this event together. Look, I'll be very quick. I think it's a pleasure to have the last word a little bit to summarize and trying to take stock of the technical part of the proceedings before we go into closing remarks. Just to jump straight into the question that was asked by the journalist, she asked me this question earlier about, what can this process do for youth? Well, with 50% of the economy still under the control of the state, releasing a large part of that is the best thing that we could do collectively for the youth. By freeing up resources, by allowing the most dynamic entrepreneurs to access finance, to get the land that they need, right? That's not happening at the moment. And there was good acknowledgement of that today. We heard, consistently from government that this is a priority, that it remains a priority. And really, if we can crystallize our objective here by reducing that state footprint in the economy, that's what we're trying to do here, I think, is to free up resources for exactly those people that are looking for those pathways and opportunities to prosperity. And I think, for me, there are 3 takeaway messages from the conversations that we've had today, and possibly one that we didn't get enough time to think about, but it's something for us to remember. The first, I think, is that this is not a process on its own. It's the easiest part is to list a company on the auction and to put it on e-Ijra website. But actually, when you think about it, there are many complementary reforms that are needed. And I think that was consistently raised. It's needed both in terms of privatization, but also on the SOE performance side. Just take the chemical sector, for example. How are you going to value a company that works with so many quasi-fiscal deficits, cheap gas? You don't really know how to value the company and its position. How do you privatize the chemical sector without having a strong competition policy? I see Mr. Sharukhmatov, who very kindly joined us here today. But with so many trading restrictions in the commodity exchange and price controls and the lack of a competitive environment. So it actually requires complementary policies to move in sequence, right? Similarly, capital markets legislation, that's now the Ministry of Finance's remit. How are you going to do the IPOs if you don't yet have the right regulatory regime in the capital markets? So many of these things have to move together. This is not one train on one track. This is 6 tracks with 6 trains that need to move like it's a swimming competition, right? The second thing we heard is sequencing. It's not just that these complementary things have to happen, but they have to happen in a sequence. What's the point of setting key performance indicators for companies if we're not yet clear about what the objectives, the strategic objectives of these companies are for the state? What will the state get from that company? Once we know that, we can say, okay, are you achieving that, right? And that's really, really important. And at the same time on privatization, what is the point of going to the capital markets without a capital market that's ready to take on that? And that creates many risks that then become unnecessary. And I think the third point really that was kind of mentioned from point to point was vested interests. That there are risks. We have learned from many lessons, the Macedonia experience of insiders. It has come up. It's not a risk that does not exist here. So again, when thinking about complementary reforms, the commitment that the government has made to transparency, I think was welcome. And I think pushing through with that will be very important. What's the one thing we didn't get a chance to talk about? I think we didn't spend as much time as we should have talking about social risks. That SOE reform brings social risks. We addressed a little bit of that in the beginning, the participation of domestic investors. And it's really encouraging to see participation from domestic private sector. We don't want people to be left behind. But similarly, once these institutions are proceeding through a privatization process, there are risks, there are human risks to these processes. Really investing early in robust systems, not just to pay off a displaced worker, but to think actively about what that displaced worker could do for a future economy. How can we skill and retrain these people? What could we do to bring them back? We don't want to lose that capacity. We don't want to lose that knowledge. What can we do to repurpose it for the future economy? And I'll stop there. I think for me, these are the key takeaway messages. More focus on complementarity, more focus on sequencing, and more coordination. And finally, a real reminder that vested interests and risks prevail, and not to ignore those social risks. So with that, I will hand it back to Yar. Thank you.
Thank you, Vinny. An excellent summation, and I think a very important message at the end on social risk. And the World Bank has invested heavily in trying to create programs and pathways to improve social welfare. Ms. Burunchuk, now we turn to you to sort of help wrap up this impressive event that started earlier this afternoon. You have the floor.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
I will speak in Russian. What an event. Дорогие коллеги, уважаемые участники, хотела сказать, что на самом деле для меня очень большая честь выступить с заключительным словом на этом очень важном форуме по программе приватизации и трансформации государственных предприятий, которая, в принципе, является одной из наиважнейших стратегических задач для Узбекистана на пути сокращения роли госпредприятий и расширения участия частного сектора в экономике. И я очень с большим интересом следила за дискуссией за прошедшие почти 4 часа, за, в принципе, очень содержательной дискуссии, которая дала нам очень много пищи для размышления на будущее. Я хочу сказать, что то большое количество участников, которые присутствуют сегодня в зале, которые подключились к обсуждению виртуально, и то разнообразие участников и организаций, которые они представляют, показывает, насколько высок интерес к данной теме. Мне было очень интересно, и я надеюсь, что всем участникам было очень интересно услышать о тех важных преобразованиях, которые сегодня реализует Узбекистан, ну и о тех вызовах, которые стоят перед теми, кто формирует и реализует политику в данной сфере. И мы также узнали от международных экспертов и партнеров по развитию о том ценном опыте других стран, которые уже реализовали аналогичные преобразования, и их предложения, как можно справиться с теми вызовами, которые на сегодня стоят перед Узбекистаном. Узбекистан на самом деле находится в очень выгодном положении, потому что он может использовать этот огромный накопленный опыт для своих реформ, при этом минимизируя те ошибки, которые были допущены в других странах. Ну и сегодня мы услышали о многих важных уроках, таких как необходимость надежной нормативно-правовой базы, необходимость ясной стратегии и многолетних планов, необходимость очень четкой институциональной структуры и четком распределении функций, системы подотчетности, стратегии по решению социальных последствий приватизации. Но если бы вы меня спросили выделить один самый важный урок, самый важный аспект, который исходил из сегодняшней нашей дискуссии, то я бы на самом деле выделила то, как важно обеспечить прозрачность и подотчетность в процессе трансформации и приватизации государственных предприятий. Прозрачность будет иметь первостепенное значение для успеха реформ в этой области, так как это, в принципе, должно укрепить доверие к процессу и подтвердит то, что данные преобразования направлены на повышение благосостояния страны и благосостояния людей в Узбекистане. В заключение позвольте мне от имени Всемирного банка поблагодарить всех вас за участие в этом очень важном и интересном форуме и пожелать вам успехов в дальнейшей работе, в принципе, всем нам успехов в дальнейшей работе, потому что Всемирный банк готов и дальше оказывать поддержку Узбекистану в осуществлении этих очень важных реформ. Большое спасибо.
Thank you, Ms. Burunchuk. Mr. Ortikov, Ms. Burunchuk mentioned the themes of openness, accountability, and transparency. And in the letter that you have written in the agenda that has been distributed today, those are also themes that you highlighted as very important. I'm sure that there's a lot to reflect on, but I turn the floor over to you to close this important forum.
Katta rahmat, hurmatli xalqaro forum ishtirokchilari. Biz Jahon banki bilan ushbu forumni tashkillashda bitta masalaga kelishdikki, mana shu jarayonni yo'lga qo'yishdan oldin mana agar e'tibor qilsanglar transformatsiya va xususlashtirish jarayonlari yangi etapdagi islohotlar. Biz katta yo'lni boshida turibmiz. O'zimiz ishlarimizni bir qanchalik to'g'ri boshlayotganligimizni, oldimizga qo'ygan maqsadlarimizni to'g'riligini yana bir marta eng yaxshi ilg'or tajribalar asosida bilib olmoqchimiz. Yo'limizni yana bir marta to'g'riligini shu tajriba va ilg'or tajriba asosida bilib olmoqchimiz. Shuning uchun biz Jahon bankidan mana shu ko'rinishda mana shu forumimizni tashkil qildikki, e'tibor berayotgan bo'lsanglar ham bir tomondan xalqaro moliya institutlari, o'zimizdagi investitsiya kompaniyalari vakillari o'tirishgan bo'lsa, bir tomondan mana o'ng qo'limda demak parlament vakillari, vazirlar mahkamasi, hukumat a'zolari, vazirlik idoralari va ularning orqasida bizni davlat aktivlarini boshqarish agentligini hamma rahbar xodimlari asosiy ishni bajaradigan bizni xodimlarimiz. Bular ham mana shu jarayonda bir narsani tushunib yetsinki, mana shu oldimizda turgan juda ham katta ishlar bu yuzaki emas, chuqur o'ylangan va aql bilan olib boriladigan ishlar. Biz yana bir marta tushunib yetamizki, mana shu birinchi navbatda hozir davlat korxonalarini isloh qilish bo'yicha strategiyani qabul qilinganligi bu dastlabki qadamlarimiz. Albatta biz juda ham chuqur tushunib turibmiz. Bu davlat mulkini boshqarish to'g'risidagi qonunni qabul qilinishi, xususlashtirish to'g'risidagi qonunni yangi tahrirda adashmagan holda, chuqur o'ylangan holda qabul qilinishini va shu asosda keyingi shahdam qadamlarimizga o'tishimiz kerakligini tushunib turibmiz. Shuning uchun ham mana shunday bir muhokama paneli tashkil etilganligi yana bir marta hammamiz yo'limizni aniqroq bilib olishga xizmat qiladi va men bu yerda ishtirok etgan barcha ma'ruzachilarga, o'zini fikrini bildirgan hamma ishtirokchilarga katta rahmat aytaman va ushbu xalqaro forumdan katta bir yuk bilan, oldimizda turgan katta bir vazifalar bilan o'zimga shu narsani qabul qilyapmanki, hali yana qiladigan ishlarimiz ko'p. Ayniqsa har bitta qadamimizni shaffofligini, ochiqligini ta'minlash masalasida ayrim holatlarda mana shu ochiqlik, shaffoflik to'g'risida ham gap ketganda buni ham yana tushuntirib aytishimiz kerakki, hali ko'zga ko'rinarli bir real ishlar qilganimiz yo'q. Hammasini ochiq, oydin, shaffof qilamiz, lekin qadam-ba qadam to'g'ri yo'lni tanlagan holda hammasini ochiq, oydin, har bitta qadamimizni ochiq, oydin aytamiz va agar bizni veb-saytlarni, Telegram kanallarni, Facebookdagi kanallarimizni kimdir kuzatib turadigan bo'lsa, har bir qadamimizni biz ommaga e'lon qilib boryapmiz va bu jarayonda davom etamiz. Shu ma'noda bugungi xalqaro forumga juda katta qiziqish bo'lgani bizni juda ham ko'nglimizni ko'tardi. 400 dan ortiq qatnashchilar qatnashdi. Bevosita 300 ga yaqin qatnashchilar onlayn aloqaga chiqishdi. Juda ham biz xursandmizki, The Economist, Financial Times, Bloomberg va Reuters kabi xalqaro matbuot kompaniyalari ham mana shu bizni xalqaro forumimizni kuzatib turganligidan juda ham biz minnatdormiz ularga va mana shu yerda muhokama qilingan masalalarni ommaga yetkazishda yaxshi maydon bo'lib xizmat qiladi deb o'ylaymiz va bevosita bugun o'zimizni mahalliy ommaviy axborot vositalari ham kuzatishdi va bevosita bu yerda o'tirgan hamma mutaxassislardan, ekspertlardan savol javoblar qilishdiki, o'ylaymanki ko'p savollarga o'zimiz to'g'ri javob topdik deb o'ylaymiz va yakunda hammaga katta rahmat aytish bilan birga mana shu kelgusidagi ishlarimizni ham sizlar bilan maslahatlashgan holda birgalikda bir xato qilmagan holda ishni tashkillaymiz deb mana shu forumni yakunlashga ruxsat berasizlar va hammanglarni mana shu yakuni bo'yicha o'z fikrlarini kerak bo'lsa yana kimdir qandaydir fikrlar bo'lsa yozma ravishda berishni so'rab qolamiz va biz o'z ishimizda buni o'rganib bir foydali jihatlarini olamiz. Albatta Jahon bankiga va boshqa xalqaro moliya institutlariga katta rahmat aytamiz. Bevosita mana shu forumni shunchalik tashkillashda ishtirok etgan barcha shu Jahon banki komandasiga o'zimni chuqur minnatdorchiligimni izhor etaman. Hammaga katta rahmat va hammanglarni mana shu kechki fursatga taklif qilaman. Katta rahmat.
Thank you very much. We have learned that it is a team effort, transformation and privatization. For those of us in Tashkent and those that are able to stay, dinner is being served next door. For those joining us on the stream, we are signing off in Tashkent and we thank you for your participation. Goodbye, everyone.